Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. St. Helena Island had always possessed an unsettling undercurrent beneath its scenic beauty. The coastal South Carolina landscape, with its sprawling marshes and ancient live oaks, created a postcard-perfect setting that concealed something more sinister. I had lived there since childhood, becoming accustomed to the island's quirks and rhythms. But even familiarity couldn't fully neutralize its effect. It was late October 2019 when everything changed. The air had taken on that particular autumn chill that made the Spanish moss seem more like funeral shrouds than natural decorations. I was 17 then, restless and bored in the way only teenagers in small communities can be. My friend Miles had moved to the island just 2 years prior, and unlike most transplants, he'd adapted quickly to our slower pace of life. We had bonded over our mutual interest in local history and exploration, spending countless weekends investigating abandoned structures and forgotten paths through the maritime forest. The morning it all began, Miles arrived at my house just after 9, wearing his usual faded jeans and a navy windbreaker. His expression showed a mix of excitement and caution, the perfect description of his personality. "I found something weird yesterday," he said, settling onto my porch step, while helping my dad clear brush behind our property. "There's this path I've never noticed before." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "Your place backs up to the Russell Preserve, right?" "That's all protected land," Miles nodded. "Exactly. Which means nobody should have been making trails through there. But this one, it doesn't look natural, and it goes deep." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten slightly. The Russell Preserve consisted of nearly 100 acres of relatively untouched maritime forest. Local folklore claimed parts of it had once been burial grounds, though historians disputed this. "What makes it weird?" I asked, already calculating how much daylight we'd have if we left immediately. Miles hesitated, glancing toward the tree line visible beyond my yard. "It's lined with these strange marks carved into trees, and the spacing is too perfect to be random. Someone made that path deliberately. I should have recognized the warning in my instinctive unease. Instead, I felt that familiar pull of curiosity that always overrode better judgment. "Let me grab my backpack," I said, standing. "We should bring water and my GPS tracker in case we lose cell service." Neither of us could have anticipated how that simple decision would alter the course of our lives, or how deeply we would regret our curiosity. By 10:30 that morning, we stood at the edge of Miles' backyard, facing the dense wall of vegetation that marked the preserve's boundary. October sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, creating dappled patterns that shifted with the gentle breeze. From the outside, nothing about the tree line suggested anything unusual. "It's about 20 yards in," Miles said, adjusting his backpack straps. "Follow me." We pushed through the initial tangle of underbrush, stepping over fallen branches and navigating around thorny bushes. The transition from maintained yard to wilderness was abrupt. Within moments, we were enveloped by the forest's distinctive atmosphere. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and ambient sounds became muffled, as though the trees themselves absorbed noise. I had explored these woods countless times before, but something felt different today. The usual background symphony of birds and insects seemed diminished, creating a strange vacuum of sound that made our footsteps appear unnaturally loud. "There," Miles pointed. The path revealed itself subtly at first, just a slightly less overgrown corridor through the trees. But as we moved forward, its artificial nature became undeniable. The ground was packed down in a consistent width of about 3 feet, with unusually straight edges for a forest trail. "Look at the trees," Miles whispered, his voice tight. That's when I noticed the markings. crude symbols etched into the bark of almost every other tree flanking the path. They weren't random graffiti, but appeared deliberate and systematic. Some resembled archaic letters, while others formed geometric patterns that nagged at the edges of recognition without quite resolving into anything familiar. "These weren't here when I was a kid," I said, running my fingers over one of the marks. The carving felt oddly warm beneath my touch. "Someone's been coming here recently." The path stretched ahead, disappearing around a gentle curve deeper into the preserve. An inexplicable reluctance settled in my chest, making each step forward require conscious effort. The forest seemed to press closer around us, branches hanging lower than natural gravity should allow. "Do you hear that?" Miles asked suddenly, freezing in place. I strained to listen, initially perceiving nothing but the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Then faintly I caught it, a sound so subtle it might have been imagination. Something like rhythmic tapping, distant but consistent. "Could be a woodpecker," I suggested, though it didn't match any woodpecker I'd ever heard. "No," Miles shook his head. "It's too regular, too intentional." We continued forward, drawn by curiosity that overpowered our growing discomfort. With each step, the tapping became marginally clearer, though no louder. It maintained a pattern: 3 quick taps, pause, 2 slow taps, longer pause. Repeat. That struck me as communication rather than random noise. The path began to slope downward, leading us into a depression I'd never known existed within the preserve. The canopy thickened above us, shrouding the trail in premature twilight despite the morning hour. The air grew increasingly dense and carried a faint metallic scent that reminded me of approaching thunderstorms. "We should mark our route," I suggested, pulling a small notebook from my pocket. I tore pages and began folding them into small triangles to leave as breadcrumbs. Miles nodded, visibly relieved at the precaution. "Good idea. I'm not sure I could find my way back without reference points." I didn't mention that this admission disturbed me deeply. Miles had an excellent sense of direction, far better than mine. If he felt disoriented in these woods we'd both explored for years, something was genuinely wrong. The path continued its gentle descent for nearly 20 minutes, leading us deeper into terrain that felt increasingly unfamiliar. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made me acutely aware of my own heartbeat. My watch showed 11:43, yet the forest's dimness suggested late afternoon. "I don't think we should go much further," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "This part of the preserve doesn't feel right." Miles nodded but continued forward, drawn by the same inexplicable pull I felt. "Just a little more. I want to see where the path ends." As we rounded another bend, the trail widened into a small clearing, about 20 feet in diameter. Unlike the dense vegetation surrounding it, this circle was almost entirely barren, just hard-packed earth with a few struggling weeds. At its center stood a massive oak tree, far larger than any I'd seen on the island before. What made the scene truly unsettling was the arrangement of stones around the oak, flat, rectangular pieces placed in a perfect circle, each bearing the same strange markings we'd seen on the trees. They resembled crude headstones, though too small and numerous to mark actual graves. "Someone's been using this place," I whispered, fighting the urge to retreat. "Recently." Miles approached one of the stones, crouching to examine it more closely. "These symbols, they remind me of something I saw in my father's history books. Old island dialects had written forms that used marks like these." I was about to respond when a voice cut through the silence, distant but unmistakable. "Help! Please help me!" We both froze, exchanging startled glances. The voice had sounded young, perhaps a child's, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strained and unnatural in the stillness. No response came, just the returning silence that seemed to absorb my words. I checked my phone. No service, as expected in this remote section of the preserve. "We should go see if someone's hurt," Miles said, though his expression betrayed his uncertainty. "Help me!" The voice came again, clearer this time, seeming to emanate from a narrow path continuing beyond the oak tree. Something felt profoundly wrong. The voice was too clear, too perfect in its distress, like an actor's performance rather than genuine panic. And its sudden appearance in these strange surroundings triggered every warning instinct. "Wait!" I grabbed Miles's arm as he moved toward the new path. "Think about this. We're at least 2 miles from any trail. How would a kid get this deep into the preserve alone?" Miles hesitated, reason battling with instinct. Maybe they wandered off from a hiking group, or it could be someone who lives near the preserve's other boundary. And they just happened to end up at this exact clearing, with all these strange markings. I gestured around us. Before Miles could respond, something moved at the edge of my vision, a quick shadow slipping between trees beyond the clearing. Too large for a raccoon or fox, too low to the ground for a deer. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Miles nodded slowly, face draining of color. "Someone's watching us." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly, charged with tension. The clearing no longer felt like a discovery, but a trap, as though we'd been lured deliberately to this spot. "We need to leave," I said firmly. "Now." This time Miles didn't argue. We turned back toward our entry point, only to find the path looked markedly different. Where we'd come through a relatively wide opening, the trees now seemed to crowd closer together, branches intertwining in patterns that couldn't have formed naturally in the time we'd spent in the clearing. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as I realized the obvious truth. We were being manipulated. Whether by people or by some aspect of the environment I couldn't explain, something wanted us here. "Help me, please!" The voice called again, louder and more insistent, unmistakably coming from directly behind us now. We began moving quickly away from the clearing, following our paper markers. The forest seemed to resist our departure, branches reaching lower, roots rising higher to trip our steps. The temperature continued to drop, our breath becoming visible in small white clouds. That's when I heard Miles inhale sharply beside me. He'd stopped walking and was staring at something ahead of us on the path. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze. In the middle of the trail lay one of my folded paper markers, soaked through with what appeared to be fresh blood. My mind desperately searched for rational explanations. Perhaps an injured animal had found our paper marker and bled on it. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate twisted prank. But the pristine condition of the blood, still wet, still glistening in the dim light, defied simple reasoning. "Don't touch it," I warned Miles, who had crouched for a closer look. He nodded, standing quickly. "It's fresh, very fresh." The implications hung unspoken between us. Either someone was injured nearby, or someone wanted us to believe they were. Neither possibility felt reassuring in these increasingly strange surroundings. "Let's keep moving," I said, stepping carefully around the bloodied paper. "Stick to the trail. Watch for the rest of our markers." We proceeded more cautiously now, scanning the forest around us with heightened vigilance. The shadows between trees seemed to shift independently of the light, creating an illusion of movement that kept drawing my attention. My heartbeat accelerated, pumping adrenaline that sharpened my senses while simultaneously making me question their reliability. The path began to ascend slightly, which should have been encouraging. We'd been descending for most of our journey in. Yet something felt off about the incline. The trees didn't match my memory, and certain landmarks I'd noted were missing. "Miles," I said quietly, "I don't think this is the same path we came in on." He stopped, looking around with growing concern. "But we've been following your markers." "I know. That's what worries me." The realization settled heavily between us. Either someone was moving our markers, or the forest itself was changing around us. Neither possibility seemed plausible, yet the evidence was undeniable. A soft rustling sound came from behind a nearby thicket, deliberate movement rather than wind. I motioned for Miles to be still, and we both stood frozen, barely breathing. The rustling stopped, followed by an unnatural silence. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl, a low, wet breathing like someone with fluid in their lungs. "Is someone there?" Miles called out, his voice cracking slightly. The breathing stopped immediately. In its place came complete silence. Not just the absence of the strange breathing, but an absolute void of sound. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. It was as though someone had pressed a mute button on the entire forest. This acoustic vacuum lasted perhaps 15 seconds before being broken by a singular, bone-chilling sound. My name, whispered from somewhere alarmingly close, in a voice that was distinctly not Miles. I spun around, scanning the undergrowth, but saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" I asked Miles, my voice barely audible. His wide eyes confirmed he had. "It knew your name," he whispered. "How could it know your name?" The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. We were overreacting, mishearing things, allowing the strange environment to fuel paranoia. But deeper instincts, ancient warning systems, hardwired into human consciousness, were screaming danger. "We need to get back to the clearing," I decided suddenly. "We know that location. From there we can try another direction." Miles looked doubtful. "Back toward whatever made that sound?" "We're already going deeper into unknown territory. At least we recognize the clearing." Reluctantly he nodded, and we turned around, now following the path back downhill. The descent felt steeper than before, forcing us to brace against trees to maintain balance. Each trunk we touched felt unnaturally warm, almost feverish, despite the increasingly cool air. After about 10 minutes of careful navigation, the path opened onto a clearing, but not the one with the large oak and stone circle. This space was smaller, roughly circular, and dominated by a structure that stopped us both in our tracks. Standing in the center was what appeared to be a crude shelter built from branches and animal hides. It resembled a primitive lean-to, but constructed with disturbing precision. The branches formed perfect right angles where they joined, secured with what looked like sinew rather than rope. The hides stretching across the frame appeared fresh, still carrying a faint reddish tint that suggested recent preparation. Most unsettling were the objects hanging from the structure's edges, small bundles of leaves, feathers and bones tied with human hair in varying colors and lengths. "We haven't been here before," Miles stated flatly, voice tight with tension. "No," I agreed. "This isn't anywhere we've been today." The shelter's entrance faced away from us, a dark opening that revealed nothing of its interior. A small fire pit sat extinguished before it, ashes still showing traces of warmth when I cautiously examined them from a distance. "Someone's been here very recently," I whispered. As if in response to my observation, a sound emerged from within the shelter, that same wet, labored breathing we'd heard earlier, now louder and more distinct. "Hello?" I called out, surprising myself with my boldness. "We're lost hikers. We need directions back to the main trail." The breathing stopped abruptly. Seconds stretched into a full minute of silence. Then from the dark entrance came a response that turned my blood to ice. "I've been waiting for you to find me," said a voice that sounded simultaneously young and ancient, familiar and alien. "I need your help." Neither of us moved as the voice from the shelter fell silent. The clearing seemed to contract around us, the surrounding trees bending inward as if listening. My throat constricted, making each breath shallow and insufficient. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar. A soft rustling came from within the shelter, like fabric dragging across dry leaves. "A traveler like yourselves," the voice replied. "Lost for much longer than you've been." There was something profoundly wrong with the cadence of the speech, words flowing together in places they shouldn't, pausing where no pause belonged. It reminded me of someone learning English from text rather than conversation. Miles stepped slightly behind me, his breathing rapid and shallow. "We should go," he whispered, barely audible. I nodded almost imperceptibly, taking a small step backward without turning away from the shelter. "We need to get back," I called out. "People are expecting us." The laughter that followed chilled me to my core, not because it was menacing, but because it sounded perfectly normal, like a young woman's laugh of genuine amusement. The dissonance between that pleasant sound and our surroundings intensified my sense of wrongness. "No one expects you," the voice said confidently. "You told no one where you were going. You never do." The statement's accuracy sent a jolt of fear through me. How could anyone know our habits? We'd been exploring the island together for years, rarely telling anyone our specific destinations. "What do you want?" I asked, continuing our slow retreat toward the path. Another rustle came from the shelter, more pronounced this time. "Just help," the voice replied. "I've been waiting for someone who could understand." A figure began to emerge from the shelter's darkness, gradually, as though reluctant to be fully seen. First came hands, pale and dirt-streaked, pushing aside the hide covering the entrance. Then arms, thin but muscular, followed by shoulders hunched slightly forward. What stepped fully into the light wasn't the monster my imagination had conjured, but something far more unsettling in its ordinariness. A young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, dressed in tattered hiking clothes. Her face was gaunt but not unhealthily so, her eyes large and dark against pale skin. Her hair hung in tangled brown waves past her shoulders. Only two details disrupted this seemingly normal appearance: a strange pattern of raised scars visible on her neck, disappearing beneath her collar, and her feet, which were completely bare and showed no signs of injury despite the rough forest floor. "Who are you?" Miles asked, his voice steadier than I expected. The woman tilted her head slightly, regarding us with an expression that shifted between curiosity and calculation. "My name is Ruby," she said. "I've been living in these woods since I got separated from my hiking group." "When was that?" I asked, noticing now that her clothing, while dirty, showed none of the deterioration expected from extended outdoor exposure. "October," she replied simply. "This October?" Miles pressed. "That was just a few weeks ago." Ruby smiled, revealing teeth that appeared too white, too perfect for someone surviving in the wilderness. "October 1997, she said. The claim was so absurd it momentarily disrupted my fear. "That's impossible," I stated flatly. "That would mean you've been here for 22 years. She nodded, apparently pleased by my calculation. "The forest preserves things," she said cryptically. "Time moves differently here, especially near the center." Every instinct warned against continuing this conversation, yet I found myself unable to simply walk away. Whether from morbid curiosity or some more insidious influence, I felt compelled to understand. "The center of what?" I asked. Ruby stepped forward, moving with unusual fluidity. "I can show you. It's not far from here." Miles grabbed my arm, fingers digging in painfully. "We're not going anywhere with her," he whispered urgently. I nodded in agreement, finally breaking eye contact with Ruby. "We need to head back," I said firmly. "Our families will worry." Something flickered across Ruby's expression, a momentary distortion that reminded me of digital glitches in video. Her features seemed to shift slightly before settling back into their previous arrangement. "Of course," she said, voice suddenly hollow. "You should return before dark. The woods become active after sunset." The way she emphasized active sent another wave of dread through me. I began backing away more deliberately now, pulling Miles with me toward the path. Ruby watched our retreat with unnerving stillness, not blinking or shifting her weight as a normal person would. As we reached the edge of the clearing, she called out one final message. "When you hear someone calling for help tonight, don't answer. It isn't human anymore." We turned and ran then, abandoning all pretense of calm. The path seemed to cooperate with our escape, leading uphill more directly than I remembered. We sprinted past trees bearing those strange symbols, no longer caring about their meaning or origin. Neither of us spoke until we broke through the tree line into Miles's backyard nearly 20 minutes later. Lungs burning and legs trembling from exertion. "What the hell was that?" Miles gasped, bending over with hands on his knees. I shook my head, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't sound deranged. The rational part of my mind was already recategorizing our experience, convincing myself that Ruby was just an eccentric homeless woman, that the strange path configurations were the result of our own disorientation. But I couldn't dismiss the unnatural stillness of her posture, the impossible knowledge of our habits, or the warning that continued to echo in my thoughts. As evening approached, I would come to understand precisely what she meant. I returned home around 3 in the afternoon, making excuses to my parents about spending the morning at the public library. They accepted my explanation without question, though my mother remarked that I looked unusually pale. I blamed it on too much time indoors and retreated to my room, desperate for the solitude needed to process what had happened. Miles and I had agreed to speak by phone later, after we'd each had time to calm down and think rationally. Neither of us mentioned reporting our encounter. What would we say? That we met a woman claiming to have lived in the woods since 1997, that we'd found strange symbols carved into trees. None of it constituted an emergency requiring police attention. As daylight began to fade around 6:30, I sat at my desk attempting to sketch the symbols we'd seen, hoping familiar activity might settle my nerves. My bedroom window faced the backyard, beyond which lay a stretch of marsh grass before the tree line of another section of the preserve. I'd always found the view comforting, the transition from domestic space to wilderness representing the island's unique character. Tonight, however, the gathering darkness transformed that view into something ominous. Shadows stretched from the trees like grasping fingers, while the marsh grass swayed in patterns that seemed coordinated rather than wind-driven. I found myself checking repeatedly to ensure my window was locked. At 7:45, my phone rang. Miles, calling earlier than our planned 9 o'clock conversation. "Hey," I answered, immediately noting the tension in his greeting. "Something's happening," he said without preamble. "I've been watching the woods behind our house, and there's movement. Not animals. Too large, too deliberate." I moved to my window, staring more intently at the tree line. "What kind of movement?" "Like someone pacing just inside the boundary. Back and forth, always in the same spot. Dad saw it too, but thought it was probably deer." The hairs on my arms rose. "Do you think it's—" Miles hesitated. "I don't know, but I keep thinking about what she said, about not answering if we hear someone calling for help tonight." As if his words had conjured it, a sound carried faintly through my closed window, a distant voice calling something unintelligible from the direction of the preserve. I froze, phone clutched tightly against my ear. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Miles' breathing quickened. "You heard it too? From your house?" The implications settled heavily between us. Our homes were nearly 2 miles apart. For the same voice to be audible from both locations simultaneously was physically impossible. I moved away from the window, lowering myself onto my bed. "This can't be happening." "I'm going to record it if it happens again," Miles said, his voice steadier now, taking refuge in concrete action. "Document everything." The voice came again, louder this time, clearly calling for help. The sound sent electric pulses of fear down my spine, not because of its volume, but because of its clarity. It sounded as though the speaker was just outside my window, despite visibly empty yard. "It's getting closer," I said, struggling to keep panic from overtaking my voice. "Stay inside," Miles advised urgently. "Don't respond to it. Don't even look toward it directly. I think it's trying to make us come outside." A sudden sharp tap against my window made me jerk backward with a stifled cry. I scrambled away from the bed, heart pounding painfully against my ribs. "What happened?" Miles demanded. "Something hit my window," I whispered, pressing myself against the far wall. "Like a rock, or—" Another tap, louder this time, followed by a slow, scratching sound, the unmistakable noise of fingernails dragging across glass. Every muscle in my body locked in terror as I stared at the window. Still covered by curtains, I now desperately wished were thicker. "I can hear something at your house through the phone," Miles said, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. That scratching sound. A third tap, then silence. The voice called again from outside, no longer distant, but directly beneath my second-floor window. "Please help me. I'm hurt." The familiarity of the voice hit me like physical blow. It was perfect mimicry of my own vocal patterns, my own inflections, as though hearing a recording of myself. The wrongness of it triggered a primal fear response that transcended rational thought. "It's using my voice," I choked out, sliding down the wall until I sat huddled on the floor. Miles inhaled sharply. "Don't move. Don't make any noise. I'm going to call the police on my landline." "And tell them what?" I whispered. "They'll think we're pranking them." Before he could respond, the scratching at my window transformed into a deliberate pattern. 3 quick scrapes, pause, 2 slow scrapes, longer pause, then repeat. The exact rhythm of the tapping we'd heard in the forest. "It's trying to communicate," Miles whispered, "or it wants us to think it can." A new sound joined the scratching, a wet, labored breathing directly outside the glass. Then came words, spoken in that same borrowed voice, but distorted now, as though multiple vocal tracks were layered slightly out of sync. "I know you can hear me. I can smell your fear through the glass." My parents' bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. Even if I screamed, they might not hear me over their television. The nearest landline phone was in the hallway, requiring me to move past the window. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy thud against the glass that made the entire window frame shudder. A thin crack appeared in the upper corner, spreading slowly downward like a growing ice crystal. "It's breaking in," I gasped into the phone. Miles' voice came back desperate. "Hide! Call for your parents. I'm calling 911 now." Another impact, stronger than the first. The crack extended further, branching into a web of fractures across the glass. Whatever waited outside was going to get in within minutes. Survival instinct finally overcame paralysis. I lunged for my bedroom door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror. "Someone's trying to break in!" I heard movement from their room, my father's confused voice calling back. Then came the sound of shattering glass from my bedroom, followed by the soft thud of something heavy landing on my floor. I ran down the stairs, nearly falling in my haste. My parents emerged from their room, my father grabbing a baseball bat kept near their door. "What's happening?" my mother demanded, face pale with alarm. "Someone's in my room," I gasped. "They broke the window." My father moved decisively toward the stairs, but froze as a figure appeared at the top, a silhouette that made no sense to my terrified mind. It seemed human in basic outline, but moved with boneless fluidity, limbs bending at impossible angles as it descended the first few steps. My father raised the bat defensively. "Who are you? Get out of my house!" The figure paused, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. The hallway light illuminated enough for me to see that while its shape approximated Ruby's, something was profoundly wrong with its proportions. Its arms hung too long, fingers extended well past where knuckles should end. Its face retained Ruby's features but arranged incorrectly, as though someone had attempted to reconstruct her appearance from verbal description alone. "I need help," it said in my voice, mouth moving out of sync with the words. "I've been lost for so long." My father took an instinctive step back, the bat wavering in his hands. My mother pulled me toward the front door, fumbling for her car keys hanging on the wall hook. What happened next occurred with such speed that my conscious mind struggled to process it. The figure launched itself down the remaining stairs in a single fluid movement that defied physics. It landed directly in front of my father, one elongated hand closing around the bat while the other reached for his throat. My mother screamed, shoving me through the front door onto the porch before slamming it shut behind us. We ran for her car, the sound of my father's shouts cutting off abruptly inside the house. As my mother frantically started the engine, I looked back at our home, just in time to see every window on the ground floor simultaneously darken. as though something had extinguished all light within. My mother drove erratically down our long driveway, gravel spraying beneath the tires. Her hands shook violently on the steering wheel, knuckles white with pressure. "What was that thing?" she demanded, voice cracking with hysteria. "What happened to your father?" I couldn't answer, couldn't form words to describe what we'd just witnessed. The creature in our home defied rational explanation. My phone was still clutched in my hand, Miles' voice faintly audible, though I'd forgotten his presence during our escape. I raised the phone to my ear. "Miles, I heard everything," he responded immediately. "Police are on their way to your house." "Where are you now?" "In the car with my mom," I said mechanically. "Driving away." My mother reached the main road and turned toward town, accelerating well beyond the speed limit. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face as she repeatedly checked the rearview mirror. "Tell him to have them meet us at the police station," she instructed. "We're going straight there." I relayed the message, then asked Miles, "Are you safe? Is anything happening at your house?" "Nothing yet," he replied, tension evident in his voice. "My parents think I'm overreacting, but they've locked all the doors and windows. I'm watching the tree line from my room." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "What do you see?" Miles paused before answering. "Movement? All along the edge of the woods, like someone, or several someones, pacing just inside the shadows." My mother suddenly slammed on the brakes, throwing me against the seatbelt. I looked up to see what had caused our abrupt stop and felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by our headlights, was my father. He stood perfectly still, arms hanging at his sides, face expressionless. His clothing was intact, showing no signs of struggle or injury. Behind him, the road stretched empty into darkness. "Richard," my mother whispered, her hand moving unconsciously toward the door handle. "Mom, wait," I said urgently, grabbing her arm. "That's not Dad." She turned to me, confusion and hope warring on her face. "What are you talking about?" "It's right there." I stared at the figure, noticing details that confirmed my suspicion. My father's posture was too rigid, his stillness too complete. No breathing movement disturbed his chest, and his eyes reflected our headlights with an animal-like gleam. "It's pretending to be him," I said, my certainty growing. "Like it pretended to be Ruby, like it used my voice." Miles' voice came through the phone, sharp with alarm. "What's happening?" "It's blocking the road," I explained quickly. "Looking like my dad." "Don't stop," he advised immediately. "Whatever you do, don't get out of the car." My mother's expression hardened as she processed my words, her maternal instinct overriding emotional reaction. She shifted the car into reverse. "Hold on," she warned, checking the rearview mirror. As she began to back up, my father's figure finally moved, its head rotating with mechanical precision to track our movement, while its body remained facing forward. The unnatural motion confirmed what I'd suspected. Whatever stood before us was not human. "Go," I urged. My mother accelerated backward, executing a rapid three-point turn to face the opposite direction. As we completed the maneuver, I kept my eyes on the figure in the road. It made no attempt to pursue us, continuing its unsettling, stationary vigil. "Where do we go?" my mother asked, voice steadier now that we were moving away from immediate danger. "The police station is in town. We'd have to get past." "That thing," I thought quickly, scanning our limited options. "Miles' house. It's closer and his parents are there. Safety in numbers until the police arrive." She nodded, taking the next turn toward their neighborhood without slowing down. The windows were up, doors locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability inside the vehicle, like thin metal walls provided only illusory protection. "I told my parents you're coming," Miles reported after a brief absence from the call. "Dad's got his hunting rifle out." The statement offered minimal reassurance. Conventional weapons seemed inadequate against what we'd encountered, an entity capable of mimicry so perfect it could replicate specific voices and appearances. As we approached Miles's neighborhood, my mother suddenly let out a choked sound, pointing toward the roadside. I followed her gesture and felt my heart stutter. Another figure stood beside a mailbox, this one resembling Mrs. Johnson, our elderly neighbor. Like the false version of my father, she stood unnaturally still, watching our car pass with that same reflective gleam in her eyes. "There's another one," I whispered to Miles. "They're spreading out," he responded grimly. "Setting up a perimeter." The implications chilled me. Whatever these entities were, they appeared to be coordinating, establishing positions around our community with deliberate strategy. This wasn't random haunting or isolated incident. It was systematic hunting. We turned onto Miles's street and immediately noticed the unnatural stillness. No porch lights shone despite the early evening hour. No vehicles moved on the normally busy residential road. Houses stood dark and silent as though suddenly abandoned. "Something's wrong," my mother murmured, slowing the car instinctively. Miles' house appeared ahead, the only building showing signs of life, lights blazing from every window, a stark contrast to the surrounding darkness. His father stood on the front porch, rifle clearly visible in his hands as he scanned the street. "Call your dad," I instructed Miles. "Tell him it's us approaching in the blue sedan." As we pulled into their driveway, I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. Figures emerging from between houses, from behind trees, from shadows that seemed too shallow to conceal anything. They moved with that same unnatural fluidity I'd witnessed in our home. Their shapes human, but their movements decidedly not. "Run for the house," my mother ordered as she stopped the car. "Don't look back." We flung open the doors and sprinted toward the porch. Miles' father raised his rifle, aiming past us at the approaching figures. The distance to safety seemed to stretch impossibly as adrenaline warped my perception of time and space. Behind us, soft footfalls accelerated on pavement, too many to count, too synchronized to be human. A chorus of voices rose in perfect unison, each one perfectly mimicking someone I knew, my father, our neighbors, my school friends. "Please wait," they called. "We need your help." I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. At least a dozen figures pursued us, moving with unsettling coordination. Their faces were recognizable as people from our community, but their expressions remained identical, blank, observant, hungry. Miles burst through the front door as we reached the porch, holding it open as his father continued aiming past us. My mother pushed me through the entrance before following, and Miles's father backed in last, slamming the door and engaging multiple locks. "What the hell is happening?" Miles's mother demanded, clutching a baseball bat with white-knuckled hands. Through the front windows, we watched the figures halt their advance about 20 yards from the house. They formed a perfect semicircle across the front yard, standing motionless, watching the house with unwavering attention. "They've surrounded us," Miles' father reported after checking the rear windows. "They're everywhere, just waiting." A police siren wailed in the distance, approaching rapidly. The figures on the lawn turned as one to face the sound, their movements synchronized like dancers in a macabre ballet. "The police won't understand what they're walking into," I said, sudden dread washing over me. "They think it's a normal break-in." Miles grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the window. "We need to warn them somehow. If they stop their cars, if they approach those things on foot." The unfinished thought hung in the air. We all understood the likely outcome. His father pulled out his phone. "I'll call dispatch directly. Tell them officers are heading into a potentially hazardous biological situation. That should make them approach with caution at least." As he made the call, I returned to the window, watching the figures with horrified fascination. They remained motionless, facing the direction of the approaching sirens. Unlike humans, they showed no shifting of weight, no small adjustments of posture, perfect stillness that no living being could maintain. "What do they want?" my mother whispered, coming to stand beside me. The question triggered a memory, Ruby's words in the forest. The forest preserves things. Time moves differently here. A terrible understanding began to form in my mind, not of what these entities were exactly, but of what might have created them. Something ancient in the forest, something that had been collecting and preserving aspects of visitors for far longer than we realized. "I think they want us to join them," I answered softly, "to become whatever they are." The police sirens grew louder, then abruptly cut off about a block away, the officers apparently heeding the warning to approach cautiously. The figures on the lawn turned back toward the house in perfect synchronization. Their blank expressions shifted simultaneously into identical smiles, clinical reproductions of human expression without understanding of the emotion behind it. As one, they took a single step forward. Dawn broke over St. Helena Island on October 27, 2019, revealing a community forever changed. The official reports documented a mass psychosis event affecting approximately 30 residents in our neighborhood, an incident that authorities attributed to potential contamination from algal blooms in the nearby marshes. Scientific teams collected water and soil samples, while public health officials conducted interviews with affected families. The truth, of course, was substantially different from these sanitized explanations. When police arrived at Miles' house that night, they found the yard empty, no sign of the entities that had surrounded us for hours. Inside, they discovered two terrified families with a story so implausible that the responding officers clearly struggled to maintain professional composure. Only when they returned to my family's home and found the shattered window, signs of struggle, and my father's inexplicable absence did they begin taking our account more seriously. My father was found the following morning, wandering along the edge of the preserve, disoriented and suffering from hypothermia, but otherwise physically unharmed. He had no memory of the previous night, no recollection of the entity that had taken his form or of how he had escaped our home. The last thing he remembered was going to bed earlier that evening. He was not the only one. Throughout that night and into the next day, 12 residents of our community were discovered in similar states, confused, amnesiac, and drawn to the boundaries of the wooded preserve. All exhibited the same symptoms: memory loss, disorientation, and a strange fixation on the forest. Medical examinations revealed nothing physically wrong beyond mild dehydration and exposure. What the authorities failed to acknowledge, what they perhaps couldn't process, were the subtle changes in those who returned. My father came back different in ways difficult to articulate. His mannerisms remained familiar, his memories of our family intact, but something fundamental had shifted. He stared a moment too long sometimes, smiled a beat too late in conversations. His movements occasionally displayed that fluid quality I'd witnessed in the entities, nothing dramatic enough to alarm strangers, but unmistakable to those who knew him well. Similar reports circulated quietly among families of other returned individuals. Mrs. Johnson developed an uncanny ability to mimic voices after hearing them just once. Mr. Peterson began sleeping with his eyes open, perfectly still throughout the night. Children reported that their returned parents sometimes spoke in unison with television programs they'd never seen before. The preserve was temporarily closed for environmental testing, then reopened with new warning signs about potential toxic exposures. No one mentioned the paths with strange symbols, the clearing with stone markers, or the crude shelter that investigation teams apparently never found, despite our detailed descriptions. Miles and I never returned to those woods. Our friendship intensified through shared trauma, but our explorations ended permanently. We compiled our observations, recorded our experiences, and kept private documentation of the ongoing oddities exhibited by those who returned, including my father, whose strange behaviors gradually became our new normal. 3 months after that October night, Ruby's body was discovered by hikers near the preserve's western boundary. Dental records identified her as Ruby Kavanaugh, a college student who had indeed disappeared while hiking in October 1997. The coroner estimated she had died only 72 hours before discovery, though her clothing matched what she had been wearing when she vanished 22 years earlier. The official cause of death was exposure, though the autopsy noted unusually preserved tissue and inexplicable anatomical anomalies that were redacted from public reports. I often wonder what existed in that forest long before humans settled the island, what ancient presence learned to preserve, to mimic, to hunt through imitation. Sometimes I catch my father watching the tree line from our kitchen window, expression blank, body unnaturally still. In those moments, I wonder how much of him returned that night, and how much remains in the woods, perhaps preserved in some form we can't comprehend. The voice still comes sometimes, calling for help from just beyond the tree line. It knows better than to use my voice now. Instead, it calls in the voices of strangers, perhaps hoping we've forgotten our experience enough to respond. We never answer, never approach. The entities rarely venture beyond the forest boundary anymore, content to wait for unwary visitors to enter their domain. Miles and I graduated high school this past spring and left for colleges on the mainland. Distance has provided some relief, but certain knowledge can never be escaped. Something ancient dwells in those maritime forests, something that has learned to wear humanity like an ill-fitting garment. It watches, waits, and calls for help when it senses vulnerability. St. Helena Island continues its quiet existence. New families move in, tourists visit the historic sites, and locals swap increasingly distorted versions of what they call the incident. Few connect the subtle changes in returned residents, the persistent whispers from the woods, or the steadily increasing number of hikers reported missing each year. I've learned to live with the understanding that some mysteries should remain unexplored, some voices unanswered. When I visit home during breaks, I keep my blinds closed at night and avoid looking directly at my father when his movements become too fluid, too perfect, and I never, under any circumstances, enter the preserve, especially when I hear someone calling for help. I'm afraid of that place. Even now, typing these words in 2022, 17 years after my last visit, my hands tremble slightly. Knight's Landing, a name we gave it as children that persisted into our adolescence. Located in Northern California, approximately an hour from the coast. It sits in a dry valley surrounded by dense woods that seem to absorb sound and light alike. This isolated property served as my second home from ages 4 through 15. My Uncle Kenneth purchased it in 1995 as a weekend retreat, and our extended family gathered there almost every weekend. The adults called it the country house, but we children knew better. We understood its true nature, a place where darkness had substance, where silence spoke volumes. The 2-acre property sat at the outskirts of Millfield, population 2732, a town so small and unremarkable that travelers often passed through without realizing they'd been there. Knight's Landing existed just beyond the town's awareness, accessible via a winding gravel road that meandered through increasingly dense woods before opening to a small clearing where the main house stood. I remember vividly the first time I visited. Mother pointed out landmarks as we drove, the rusted mailbox marking the turn, the crooked oak that supposedly survived a lightning strike decades prior, the small wooden bridge over what would later become known to us as Cache Creek. As we approached, I recall feeling a strange weight settling in my chest, a pressure that increased with each subsequent visit. Even at 4 years old, I sensed something wasn't right about the place. "You'll love it here," my mother promised, misinterpreting my silence for anticipation rather than dread. "Your cousins will be there. You can explore the woods together." But the woods were the last place I wanted to explore. Even then, before I understood what danger truly meant, I knew the forest harbored secrets best left undisturbed. The extended family would gather there, Uncle Kenneth and Aunt Beverly, their 3 children, my mother's other siblings and their families. Occasionally, friends who had been elevated to honorary family status. At its fullest capacity, Knight's Landing housed 23 people, cramped and uncomfortable, but nonetheless together. Perhaps that was the purpose, safety in numbers, though none would admit we needed protection from anything. By day, Knight's Landing presented itself as merely rustic and isolated. By night, it transformed into something else entirely, a place where rational thought surrendered to primal fear, where the boundary between imagination and reality blurred beyond recognition. I haven't returned since 2005. I won't return. Knight's Landing claimed enough from me, from all of us. Some places should remain undisturbed, some memories buried. Yet here I am, exhuming them word by word, because silence has become its own kind of torment. The main house at Knight's Landing was a single-story structure built sometime in the 1930s, according to Uncle Kenneth. The wooden exterior had weathered to a dull grey, with paint peeling in long strips that resembled flayed skin. 3 small bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a modest kitchen, and a living room that doubled as dining space when necessary, all connected in a straight line from front to back. You could stand at the front door and see clear through to the back entrance, an architectural feature that somehow made the house feel both cramped and exposed simultaneously. Windows lined both sides of the house, though the surrounding trees blocked much of the natural light. Even on the brightest summer days, the interior remained in perpetual twilight, unless every lamp was illuminated. The floorboards creaked with each step, announcing movement throughout the house. Nothing remained secret inside those walls. Every footstep, every whispered conversation carried from one end to the other. The foundation had settled unevenly over decades, creating a subtle but persistent downward slope from the front door to the kitchen. Marbles placed on the living room floor would roll slowly, but inevitably toward the back of the house. As children, we found this amusing. As I grew older, I recognized it as symbolic. Everything at Knight's Landing was gradually pulled towards something unseen at the property's edge. Approximately 50 yards from the main house stood 2 long, narrow outbuildings, former garages converted for storage and occasional use during larger family gatherings. Each measured roughly 50 feet long by 10 feet wide, positioned parallel to each other with approximately 20 feet of open space between them. The first outbuilding, we called it the party house, had electricity, windows, and wooden floors. Tables and folding chairs filled the interior, ready for overflow guests during holiday celebrations. This building served as a boundary marker, the last fully illuminated structure on the property, a final outpost of comfort before the encroaching darkness. The second outbuilding had no formal name among the adults, but we children called it the Shadow House. Despite its proximity to the party house, it existed in a different realm altogether. No electricity reached this structure. Its windows had been boarded over for reasons never explained. The dirt floor remained perpetually damp, regardless of weather conditions. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, creating an opening that resembled a grimace. During daylight hours, we occasionally entered on dares, but never lingered. After sunset, nothing could compel us to approach it. Beyond the Shadow House lay 4 concrete slabs partially embedded in the ground, rectangular, uniform, unmistakably grave-like. Uncle Kenneth claimed they were foundations for a planned expansion that the previous owner abandoned. We recognized the lie immediately but never challenged it. Adults often construct convenient fictions to avoid uncomfortable truths. Past the foundations sprawled what we called the scrapyard, a chaotic collection of building materials, firewood, discarded furniture, and objects whose original purpose had long been forgotten. Massive boulders erupted from the ground throughout this area, creating a labyrinth of hiding places that should have appealed to children but somehow didn't. None of us played there willingly. Adjacent to the scrapyard stretched an empty field that separated the property from Cache Creek. The field itself was unremarkable, tall grass, occasional wildflowers, nothing to inspire particular notice. Yet it represented a boundary more significant than any fence could establish. The adults never explicitly forbade us from crossing it, but their silence on the matter spoke volumes. Some rules need not be verbalized to be understood. Cache Creek itself remained largely unseen from the property, though its presence was always felt. During spring runoff, we could hear water rushing over rocks. During summer, when the creek reduced to isolated pools, the evening air carried the scent of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. Something about that waterway disturbed even the adults, though none would admit it. Knight's Landing existed in isolation, cut off from neighbors and town alike. The nearest house stood over a mile away, occupied by an elderly couple we glimpsed only rarely when passing their property on our way to town. Cell phones received no signal. The landline worked sporadically. We were effectively alone there, a fact that became increasingly unsettling as darkness fell each evening. Children intuitively understand boundaries, particularly those established through unspoken consensus. At Knight's Landing, we developed an intricate code of conduct, rules that emerged organically through observation and shared experience rather than adult instruction. During daylight hours, most restrictions relaxed. We explored the immediate woods, constructed elaborate forts from fallen branches, played hide-and-seek among the storage buildings. The adults supervised from a distance, occasionally calling us back for meals or when we strayed too far from the main house. These were normal, healthy childhood activities in a rural setting. As sunset approached, however, the atmosphere shifted. Adults grew watchful, checking their watches with increasing frequency, finding reasons to gather the children closer to the main house. By dusk, unspoken expectations became clear. Remain within sight of the house lights, stay together in groups, and most importantly, ignore unusual sounds from the surrounding woods. Just coyotes, Uncle Kenneth would explain, when howls echoed through the trees after dark. Maybe a mountain lion passing through. His tone conveyed confidence, but his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, betraying his unease. I was 7 when I first recognized the pattern of adult behavior that contradicted their reassurances. How they always ensured doors were locked promptly at sunset. How they never ventured to the outbuildings alone after dark. How conversations halted abruptly when children entered rooms. How they positioned themselves between us and the windows as evening progressed. We were forbidden from entering the shadow house after sunset, an actual verbalized rule, one of the few explicit restrictions. The floor's uneven, Aunt Beverly would explain. You could trip and hurt yourselves in the dark. A reasonable precaution, yet inconsistent with their otherwise permissive parenting style. The 4 concrete slabs beyond the shadow house remained officially designated as abandoned foundations, but we understood their true nature. When Cousin Russell scratched away soil from the edge of one slab and discovered what appeared to be carved lettering, Uncle Kenneth's reaction, swift removal of Russell from the area, immediate covering of the exposed section with fresh dirt, and a rare display of genuine anger, confirmed our suspicions. These aren't graves, Uncle Kenneth insisted that night at dinner, addressing the entire family, though no one had publicly suggested otherwise. The previous owner poured concrete for a workshop extension. That's all. His declaration ended all further discussion on the matter, at least among the adults. Among ourselves, we children maintained a different narrative. The slabs covered remains, human or animal, we couldn't agree, but all of us sensed the wrongness of disturbing them. Even Russell, typically the most daring among us, never returned to his excavation. The scrapyard beyond the concrete slabs operated under an unspoken time restriction, acceptable for brief exploration during bright daylight, increasingly forbidden as shadows lengthened. No adult ever specifically prohibited entry, yet their reactions when we emerged from that area grew progressively more anxious as evening approached. "What were you doing back there?" my mother asked once when I returned from the scrapyard alone, her voice pitched higher than normal. Did you see anything unusual?" "Just looking for building materials for our fort," I answered, confused by her intensity. She visibly relaxed. "Stay closer to the house from now on. It'll be dark soon. The empty field beyond the scrapyard established our absolute boundary. None of us, not even Russell during his most rebellious phase, suggested crossing it to reach Cache Creek after sunset. During daylight hours, adults occasionally led expeditions to the creek for fishing or exploration, but always returned well before dusk, always maintaining direct supervision, always counting heads repeatedly during the journey back. We understood, without being told, that whatever dangers Knight's Landing harbored increased exponentially beyond that field. The creek itself seemed to exist in another realm entirely, visible and accessible, yet somehow separate from the relative safety of the property. Most significant among our unspoken rules, never discuss nighttime disturbances the following morning. The scratching at windows, the footsteps on the roof, the shadows that moved independently of objects casting them. These experiences remained unacknowledged in daylight. Adults pretended not to hear the sounds that woke them repeatedly throughout the night. Children pretended not to notice the exhaustion evident in adult faces at breakfast. This conspiracy of silence persisted for years. As we children grew older, we maintained the pretense, understanding instinctively that acknowledging these occurrences would somehow make them more real, more dangerous. Silence became our collective shield against truths none of us, children or adults, were prepared to confront. Summer 2001 marked a turning point in our relationship with Knight's Landing. I was 11, caught in that uncomfortable transition between childhood and adolescence, desperate to prove my courage to both myself and my cousins. Russell, 14 and increasingly dismissive of adult authority, suggested a midnight expedition to the Shadow House. Cousin Josephine, 13 and self-appointed voice of reason, objected immediately. "We're not supposed to go there after dark," she reminded us, glancing toward the adults gathered around the television in the living room. "They never said why," Russell countered, his voice low. "Don't you want to know what they're hiding from us?" I remained silent, torn between fear and curiosity. The youngest cousin present, Wesley, only 9, watched this exchange with wide eyes. "It's just a storage shed," Josephine insisted, though her tone lacked conviction. "Then why is it off limits?" Russell pressed. "Why did they board up the windows? Why no electricity when the other building has it?" None of us could answer these questions satisfactorily. The inconsistencies in adult explanations regarding the Shadow House had long troubled us, becoming more apparent as we grew older. "Tonight," Russell announced, decision made, after everyone's asleep. "Bring your flashlights." That night, sleep eluded me as I waited for Russell's signal, 3 quiet taps on the floor beside my sleeping bag. The adults had retired to their respective bedrooms hours earlier, leaving us children arranged across the living room floor in our usual configuration of sleeping bags and blankets. The taps came shortly after midnight. Russell's face appeared above me, features barely visible in the darkness. Josephine was already standing, reluctance evident in her posture, but unwilling to be excluded. Wesley sat up, rubbing his eyes, clearly regretting his insistence on being included. We moved silently through the house, avoiding the known squeaky floorboards, easing the back door open just enough to slip through. The night air struck my face, unusually cold for July. Above us, stars pierced the darkness with remarkable clarity, yet provided insufficient light to navigate the yard. Russell switched on his flashlight, keeping it pointed downward to minimize visibility from the house windows. We followed in single file, Russell leading, then Josephine, myself and Wesley bringing up the rear. The beam illuminated our path, in short bursts, revealing just enough ground to avoid obstacles. The party house loomed ahead, a familiar silhouette against the night sky. We skirted its perimeter, remaining in shadow, acutely aware that we had already transgressed a major boundary. No child ventured outside after dark without adult accompaniment. This alone would earn significant punishment if discovered. The 20 feet separating the party house from the Shadow House seemed to stretch endlessly. The flashlight beam weakened as we crossed this space, as though the darkness actively resisted our intrusion. The air grew noticeably colder with each step. "Maybe we should go back," Wesley whispered, voicing the thought echoing in my own mind. "Don't be a baby," Russell hissed, though his earlier confidence had diminished considerably. The shadow house materialized before us, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. The crooked door hung partially open, creating a black void that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Russell's flashlight beam passed across the entrance, revealing nothing of the interior. "I'll go first," he declared, his voice slightly higher than normal. "Josephine, you hold the light. Point it through the door, but don't come in until I say." Josephine accepted the flashlight, positioning herself to illuminate the entrance while maintaining distance. Russell approached the doorway slowly, hesitated visibly, then stepped inside. "See? Nothing to worry about," he called back, voice echoing strangely within the structure. "Just old furniture and junk. Come on in." Josephine entered next, flashlight beam sweeping the interior, revealing stacked chairs, broken tables, and indeterminate shapes covered with tarps. I followed reluctantly, with Wesley gripping the back of my shirt. The interior smelled of rot and something metallic, like copper pennies left in damp soil. The dirt floor felt oddly firm underfoot, almost like packed clay rather than loose soil. As the flashlight beam moved across the walls, I noticed markings, crude symbols scratched into the wooden planks at irregular intervals. "What are those?" I asked, pointing. "Probably just previous owners messing around," Russell replied, though he moved closer to examine them. "Weird, though. They look fresh." Josephine directed the light toward the back of the building, revealing a section we had never noticed during daylight explorations, a depression in the floor approximately 6 feet in diameter, surrounded by what appeared to be small stones arranged in a circle. "That's new," Russell whispered, previous bravado entirely evaporated. "Let's go," Wesley pleaded, tugging my shirt insistently. "Please, let's go now." Before anyone could respond, the sounds began, soft at first, almost imperceptible, then increasing in volume and clarity. Scratching within the walls, not from outside, but within the structure itself, as though something moved between the exterior and interior surfaces. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The temperature dropped precipitously. My breath became visible, forming small clouds that dispersed rapidly in the frigid air. "Run!" Josephine commanded, authority suddenly evident in her voice. "Now, don't look back." We fled, abandoning all pretense of stealth, bursting through the doorway and into the night. The scratching sounds followed, increasing in intensity, seemingly emanating from every board in the structure. As we reached the midpoint between buildings, a loud crash erupted from the shadow house, the sound of something heavy falling or being thrown. None of us stopped to investigate. We sprinted across the yard, reached the main house and piled through the back door, securing it immediately behind us. Breathing heavily, we exchanged terrified glances in the kitchen's dim light. "Did everyone see the pit?" Russell asked finally, voice barely audible. We nodded collectively. "It wasn't there before," Josephine confirmed. "I've been in that building dozens of times. There was never a pit." "What were those marks on the walls?" I asked. "Not now," Russell interrupted, suddenly alert to sounds from the adults' bedrooms. "Tomorrow. We'll figure it out tomorrow." But tomorrow brought an unexpected development. At breakfast, Uncle Kenneth announced that the shadow house was being demolished that very day. "Structural issues," he explained vaguely. "Not safe anymore." He wouldn't meet our eyes during this declaration, focusing instead on his coffee cup with unusual intensity. More telling was the reaction of the other adults, complete absence of surprise or questions, as though this decision had been thoroughly discussed before our arrival at the table. By mid-afternoon, Uncle Kenneth and two men I'd never seen before had dismantled significant portions of the shadow house. By sunset, only a concrete foundation remained, the debris loaded into a truck and removed from the property entirely. The four of us maintained silence regarding our midnight exploration, understanding instinctively that admitting our presence in the building would create complications none of us were prepared to navigate. Yet questions remained. How had the adults known to destroy the building immediately after our intrusion? What had they discovered that necessitated such swift action? Most troubling, had something followed us back to the main house that night? That evening, as darkness descended, the scratching sounds previously confined to the shadow house transferred to the main house walls for the first time in our collective memory. January 2003 brought unusually heavy rainfall to Northern California. Roads flooded, creeks overflowed their banks, and isolated properties like Knight's Landing became temporarily inaccessible. Despite weather warnings, our family had gathered for Uncle Kenneth's 50th birthday celebration, intending a weekend retreat that extended to nearly a week as rising waters cut off our exit route. I was 13 by then, increasingly aware of the property's abnormalities, yet unable to articulate my concerns without sounding childish. The Shadow House incident remained unacknowledged among us cousins, though its impact lingered. Russell had grown increasingly withdrawn during family gatherings, while Josephine developed an almost obsessive vigilance, positioning herself to observe the location where the building had stood. 5 days into our weather-imposed isolation, tensions within the household had escalated considerably. Adults snapped at minor infractions, whispered arguments erupted in corners, and sleeping arrangements became contentious as everyone grew tired of constant proximity. That evening, rain hammered against the roof with unprecedented force, creating a continuous roar that made normal conversation impossible. We gathered in the living room after dinner, 17 family members crammed into a space, designed for half that number, attempting to play board games while ignoring the increasing severity of our situation. Uncle Kenneth checked the propane tanks twice that evening, confirming sufficient fuel for heating should electricity fail. Aunt Beverly inventoried remaining food supplies, calculating portions with growing concern. My mother repeatedly attempted calls on the landline, each effort meeting the same empty dial tone. By 10 o'clock, younger children had fallen asleep despite the noise. Adults continued hushed conversations, frequently glancing toward windows streaked with water. Russell, Josephine, Wesley, and I remained awake, huddled near the wood stove, ostensibly playing cards while actually monitoring adult reactions. "They're scared," Josephine whispered, nodding toward Uncle Kenneth, who stood peering through a gap in the curtains. "Look at them. This isn't just about the weather." Cache Creek must be completely flooded, Russell reasoned. The field would be underwater by now. The implication hung unspoken between us. If the creek had overflowed its banks, whatever boundary it represented had been compromised. Shortly after midnight, the electricity failed. Darkness enveloped the house instantly, followed by momentary silence as even the rain seemed to pause. Then chaos, children awakened crying, adults fumbling for flashlights, confused voices overlapping as everyone spoke simultaneously. Uncle Kenneth restored order, distributing emergency lanterns and arranging furniture to create a central, illuminated area. Adults constructed sleeping spaces within this light perimeter, positioning children toward the center, themselves forming an outer ring. "Just a precaution," my mother assured me, though her hand trembled as she arranged my sleeping bag. "The storm might get worse before it improves." By 1 o'clock, artificial calm had been established. Most family members feigned sleep, though I noticed few actually closed their eyes. The lanterns created a bubble of light that emphasized rather than diminished the darkness beyond its boundaries. Rain continued relentlessly, punctuated occasionally by wind gusts that rattled windows with increasing insistence. The scratching began at approximately 2:15, subtle at first, easily attributed to tree branches against siding. It originated at the front door, a light scraping sound that might have gone unnoticed during normal circumstances. In our heightened state of awareness, however, it commanded immediate attention. Uncle Kenneth raised himself on one elbow, exchanging glances with Aunt Beverly. No words passed between them, yet understanding clearly did. Other adults similarly alerted, shifting to sitting positions, instinctively moving closer to their respective children. The scratching intensified, transitioning from gentle scraping to deliberate rhythmic movements. It migrated from the front door to adjacent walls, then rapidly circled the house perimeter. Within minutes, the sound surrounded us completely. Front, back, both sides, seemingly produced by multiple sources moving independently yet coordinated. "Just the wind," Uncle Kenneth announced for the children's benefit, voice artificially steady, branches hitting the house. None of the adults challenged this explanation, though several exchanged skeptical glances. The nearest trees stood at least 20 feet from the house, facts we all knew but collectively agreed to ignore. The sounds evolved further, developing distinct patterns that suggested intentionality rather than random weather effects. Single scratches became groups of 3, then 5, then 3 again, sequences repeated with precision that defied natural explanation. Then abruptly, silence. Complete absence of sound, even the rain temporarily suspended. The quiet pressed against my ears with physical weight, more unsettling than the scratching had been. The impact on the roof shattered this silence, a heavy thud directly overhead, as though something substantial had landed on the structure. The ceiling visibly flexed downward at the point of impact, releasing a shower of dust that spiraled through lantern light. Children screamed. Adults moved with surprising coordination, forming a protective circle, facing outward toward unseen threats. Uncle Kenneth retrieved his shotgun from the hallway closet, a weapon I'd never previously seen him handle. "Everyone stay calm," he instructed, voice barely controlled. "This is still just the storm." Additional impacts followed, multiple points across the roof, some directly above us, others near the house perimeter. With each thud, the ceiling material strained downward, threatening structural failure. Movement became audible across the roof surface, dragging sounds interspersed with what seemed like footsteps, though no footwear could produce such distinctive clicking against shingles. "Kenneth," Aunt Beverly whispered urgently, "they've never been on the roof before." "I know," he responded, expression grim. "This is different." Their exchange confirmed suspicions I'd harbored for years. The adults knew precisely what threatened us. This wasn't their first encounter with these phenomena, merely the most severe manifestation they'd experienced. For approximately 20 minutes, the roof assault continued unabated. No section remained untouched. Impacts and movements covered every square foot of ceiling. Throughout this period, scratching at walls resumed simultaneously, creating a coordinated attack that suggested multiple entities working in concert. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. Silence returned, broken only by the normal sounds of rainfall resuming against the roof. Adult tension remained, however. Weapons stayed raised, protective positions maintained, eyes constantly scanning walls and ceiling for further threats. Dawn arrived without additional incidents. As grey light filtered through windows, Uncle Kenneth initiated a careful inspection of the house exterior. 3 other adult men accompanied him, each carrying improvised weapons. Their expressions upon returning told everything: shock, confusion, and carefully controlled fear. "Nothing," Uncle Kenneth reported, addressing the entire family. "No damage, no footprints, no evidence anything happened. But we all heard," my mother began. "Nothing happened," he interrupted firmly. The storm played tricks with the sound. That's all. This official narrative established the framework for all subsequent discussions. By unspoken agreement, the night's events became attributed to weather phenomena, structural noises, and collective imagination heightened by unusual circumstances. Yet certain facts remained difficult to reconcile with this explanation. The ceiling still showed visible indentations where impacts had occurred. Deep scratches marked exterior walls, perfectly parallel groupings that no branch could create. Most troubling, small impressions surrounded the house perimeter, spaced irregularly, but sharing identical characteristics. Circular depressions, approximately 4 inches in diameter, penetrating surprisingly deep into mud-softened ground. Uncle Kenneth filled these depressions with gravel before noon, erasing evidence without acknowledgement. By afternoon, road conditions had improved sufficiently to permit evacuation. We departed Knight's Landing with unusual haste, leaving behind numerous personal belongings in our rush to escape. 2 significant changes followed this incident. First, winter gatherings at Knight's Landing ceased entirely. The property remained unvisited between November and March each subsequent year. Second, no children were permitted to stay overnight during any season. Day visits continued, but all families departed well before sunset, regardless of occasion. The adults never discussed these policy changes directly. Like everything else at Knight's Landing, they emerged as unspoken but inviolable rules, understood and obeyed by all family members without question. August 2004 marked my final summer at Knight's Landing. At 14, I had developed an uncomfortable awareness of the property's abnormalities, while simultaneously dismissing childhood fears as imagination. This cognitive dissonance, knowing something was wrong yet unable to justify continued fear, created frustration that manifested as reckless behavior. Russell, 17 and recently licensed to drive, had transported Josephine, Wesley and myself to the property for a day visit. The adults, engaged with barbecue preparations, paid minimal attention to our whereabouts. This negligence provided opportunity I had silently anticipated for months: investigation of the forbidden field between the property and Cache Creek. "I'm going to the creek," I announced to my cousins, intentionally casual. "Anyone coming?" Russell glanced toward the adults, calculating risk. "They'll notice if we all disappear." "I'm not supposed to go alone, though," I countered, employing their own rules against them. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly. "But we stay visible from the house. No going all the way to the creek." Josephine joined without comment, while Wesley declined, preferring the safety of adult proximity. The 3 of us walked openly toward the field, our movement deliberate rather than furtive. This approach proved effective. Adults noted our direction but issued only perfunctory warnings about returning for lunch promptly. The field appeared unremarkable in daylight, approximately 2 acres of open space, covered primarily with wild grasses and occasional wildflowers. The ground sloped gently downward toward Cache Creek, visible as a line of denser vegetation, approximately quarter-mile distant. Nothing visually suggested danger or justified long-standing prohibitions against crossing this space. "This is far enough," Russell declared as we reached the field's approximate center. "We can see everything from here anyway." "I want to check something first," I replied, continuing forward without waiting for agreement. Josephine followed hesitantly, while Russell remained stationary, monitoring the house for adult reaction to our progression. The grass height increased as we moved further from the maintained property, soon reaching mid-thigh level that concealed ground conditions effectively. Approximately 10 yards before reaching the creek vegetation boundary, I discovered what instinct had led me to seek: a depression in the earth, subtle but unmistakable, forming a perfect circle approximately 20 feet in diameter. Within this circle, grass grew sparsely compared to surrounding areas, exposing soil with unusual coloration. Darker, almost black compared to the normal brown earth elsewhere. "Joe," I called softly, motioning her closer. "Look at this." She approached cautiously, expression changing from irritation to confusion as she observed the formation. "What is it? Some kind of sinkhole?" "The edge is too perfect," I noted, kneeling to examine the boundary. "Look how it forms an exact circle. This isn't natural." The soil within the circle had unusual consistency, finer than surrounding earth, almost powdery to touch, while maintaining surprising structural integrity. Despite recent rainfall, this area remained completely dry while adjacent ground retained normal moisture. "There's another one," Josephine noted suddenly, pointing approximately 30 yards to our right. Indeed, a second circular formation identical to the first was visible through grass separation. From our new vantage point, a third circle became apparent further west, partially obscured by taller vegetation, but clearly maintaining the same dimensions and characteristics. "They're in a pattern," I realized, mentally connecting the formations. Equidistant from each other, forming a larger circle around... Around what? Josephine questioned, following my gaze toward the center point these formations appeared to surround. The center point revealed nothing visually distinctive, identical tall grass, no obvious markers or disruptions. Yet something drew my attention to this specific location, creating inexplicable certainty of its significance. "Russell should see this," I suggested, turning back toward our cousin. Russell remained where we had left him, but his posture had changed dramatically. No longer monitoring the house, he now stared intently in our direction, body rigid with apparent alarm. His arms moved in emphatic gestures, clearly instructing immediate return. "Something's wrong," Josephine observed, already retreating. As we hurried back toward Russell, the cause for his concern became evident. Uncle Kenneth and two other adult men were approaching rapidly from the house, their expressions visible even at distance, anger mixed with unmistakable fear. "Run!" Russell called, abandoning discretion entirely. "Hurry!" We increased pace, struggling through tall grass, aware of adults closing distance behind us. Russell met us at the field boundary, physically pulling us onto the maintained property section with surprising force. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, voice low and intense. "They're absolutely furious." Before explanations could be offered, adults reached our position. Uncle Kenneth gripped my arm painfully, physically separating me from my cousins. "What did you see out there?" he demanded, voice unrecognizable with strain. "Tell me exactly what you saw." "Nothing," I answered instinctively, startled by his intensity. "Just the field." "We didn't reach the creek. The circles," he pressed. "Did you find the circles?" His knowledge of formations we had just discovered momentarily stunned me into silence. This confirmation that he knew precisely what existed in that field, had known all along, contradicted years of adult denial regarding Knight's Landing abnormalities. "Answer me," he insisted, grip tightening further. "Did you enter any of the circles?" "No," Josephine intervened, voice steadier than mine. "We just noticed them from outside." "What are they, Uncle Kenneth?" His expression shifted through multiple emotions, anger, fear, resignation, and finally, a calculated calm that seemed more performative than genuine. "Old livestock pens," he replied, releasing his grip on my arm. "From when this was a working farm. The soil's different because of animal waste concentration. Nothing interesting, just potentially hazardous. The ground could collapse." This explanation, delivered with practiced conviction, might have satisfied younger children. At 14, I recognized the fabrication immediately, as did my cousins. More revealing than the obvious lie was the relief evident when he confirmed we hadn't entered the formations. "You're all leaving now," he continued, tone allowing no discussion. "Russell, drive them directly home. No stops." "But the barbecue," Russell began. "Now," Uncle Kenneth interrupted. "I'll explain to your parents. Go." This abrupt dismissal marked my final visit to Knight's Landing. Multiple family gatherings occurred subsequently at the property, but various excuses were manufactured to justify my absence each time. By Christmas that year, subtle family realignments had effectively removed me from guest lists entirely. One question remained outstanding, preventing closure on the experience. What exactly were those circles? And why did their discovery warrant such extreme reaction? The answer arrived unexpectedly in April 2005, delivered by Josephine during a rare moment of privacy at a school event. Uncle Kenneth sold Knight's Landing, she informed me without preamble. The new owners started excavation for a pool installation last week. And, I prompted, recognizing significant information remained unshared. They found something in the field, she continued, voice lowered despite our isolation. Workers reached out to Uncle Kenneth before contacting authorities. What did they find? I insisted when she hesitated. Bodies, she whispered finally. 7 of them, buried in a circle around some kind of central stone marker. The police are treating it as ritual killings performed decades ago. Uncle Kenneth isn't implicated. The timing eliminates his involvement, but questions exist regarding his knowledge of the site. This revelation explained everything. The prohibited areas, the unspoken rules, the extraordinary measures to prevent discovery. The cemetery-like concrete slabs near the shadow house likely contained additional remains, explaining their protected status and the family's reluctance to acknowledge their true nature. Does this connect to the scratching? The roof incidents? I questioned. Josephine shook her head. I don't know. Maybe indirectly. Uncle Kenneth still won't discuss anything substantial, but I overheard him telling my father that they were contained as long as boundaries remained unviolated, whatever that means. It meant everything. The scratching, the roof incidents, the increasing aggression during the flood when Cache Creek overflowed, all connected to boundaries and their maintenance. Knight's Landing hadn't been a vacation property but a monitoring station, our family unwitting participants in containing something previous owners had unleashed. October 2008 found me in my first semester at university, studying psychology with particular focus on mass delusion and shared psychological experiences. My research inevitably circled back to Knight's Landing, though I carefully avoided naming the property in academic papers. Distance and education provided analytical frameworks for childhood experiences that had previously defied rational explanation. Russell had enlisted in military service immediately after high school, effectively removing himself from family dynamics. Josephine attended college on the East Coast, our communication limited to occasional text messages. Wesley remained local, but had adopted the family's unspoken policy of avoiding Knight's Landing discussions. The property itself had changed hands twice more after the initial sale, with development plans repeatedly abandoned for unspecified reasons. Academic curiosity eventually overwhelmed personal reservations. Using university resources, I initiated research into the property's history, discovering information that both validated and complicated my understanding of events experienced there. The land comprising Knight's Landing had changed ownership 27 times between 1910 and 1995, when Uncle Kenneth purchased it, an unusually high turnover, rate suggesting consistent owner dissatisfaction. Multiple newspaper archives contained oblique references to disturbances at the property, though details remained frustratingly vague. Most significantly, county records documented 7 missing persons cases between 1967 and 1973 in surrounding areas, all investigations abandoned without resolution. These discoveries coincided with Uncle Kenneth's declining health. Aggressive cancer diagnosed in late 2007 that progressed rapidly despite treatment. Family gatherings occurred with increasing frequency as his condition deteriorated, though these events transpired exclusively at his primary residence rather than Knight's Landing. During one such gathering in October 2008, I found myself momentarily alone with him, a circumstance that seemed coincidental but later appeared deliberately orchestrated. Despite physical deterioration, his mental acuity remained intact, evidenced by the focused intensity of his gaze when he addressed me. "You've been researching the property," he stated without preamble. I considered denial briefly before acknowledging truth. "Yes, you need to stop," he continued, voice strengthened by urgency. "Some knowledge carries responsibility you're not prepared to accept." "I saw the circles," I countered. "I know about the bodies. What were you hiding all those years?" His expression reflected complex calculation, measuring how much to reveal, balancing secrecy against the evident risk of information dying with him. "I purchased Knight's Landing knowing part of its history," he admitted finally. "The previous owner explained certain requirements, maintenance of boundaries, observation protocols, restrictions regarding the outbuildings and field. I believed these were superstitious precautions from an elderly man until experiencing confirmation otherwise." "What happened there?" I pressed when he paused. "Previous owners conducted rituals they didn't understand, attempting to access something beyond normal perception. They partially succeeded. His clinical detachment suggested practiced recitation rather than spontaneous disclosure. The boundaries contained results, prevented expansion beyond the property. Maintaining those boundaries became essential. The scratching sounds, the roof incidents. Test, he explained. Constant testing of containment integrity. The entities, or forces, or whatever terminology you prefer, continuously seek expansion beyond established limitations. The concrete markers serve as anchors, reinforcing boundary effectiveness. You knowingly expose children to this situation. I challenged anger displacing fear temporarily. Family gathering provided optimal containment conditions, he responded without apparent remorse. Multiple observers maintaining boundaries through collective belief and presence. Children were never targeted specifically. Your proximity to adults provided protection. The danger existed in isolation, not group exposure. His explanation presented rational framework for irrational circumstances, a system of belief and observation supposedly containing unspecified entities through collective human presence. More disturbing than supernatural implications was the calculated risk assessment that justified exposing children to potential danger. "The property has been sold twice since you left," I noted. "What about containment now?" "Ineffective," he acknowledged, fatigue suddenly evident. "New owners lack necessary information and commitment. Recent observations suggest boundary deterioration accelerating. The circles you discovered have expanded approximately 3 feet in diameter since initial measurement." "You're still monitoring the property?" This revelation suggested complexity beyond my previous understanding. "Others maintain observation," he confirmed, "though effectiveness diminishes as original participants decrease." Our conversation ended abruptly as family members returned, but sufficient information had transferred to significantly alter my understanding of Knight's Landing. Uncle Kenneth died 3 weeks later, taking unshared knowledge permanently beyond reach. His disclosure created uncomfortable ethical dilemma. Responsibility to warn current property owners versus potential participation in delusion that had consumed multiple generations. Academic skepticism suggested psychological explanation for shared experiences, yet mounting evidence supported alternative possibilities that rational frameworks struggled to accommodate. Resolution arrived unexpectedly in late November when fire destroyed the main house at Knight's Landing. Official reports cited electrical malfunction as probable cause, though investigator notes referenced unusual burn patterns inconsistent with typical structure fires. Property damage extended beyond the house to encompass most outbuildings and surrounding land. Most telling detail, firefighters reported extreme difficulty containing flames despite favorable weather conditions and rapid response time. The property has remained undeveloped since the fire. Current ownership held by investment group with no apparent construction plans. Satellite imagery shows gradual vegetation recovery throughout most areas. With notable exception, the field between former buildings and Cache Creek remains entirely barren, visible as distinctly circular pattern approximately 60 feet in diameter. 17 years have passed since my last visit to Knight's Landing. The property exists now primarily as psychological landmark rather than physical destination, a boundary between childhood and adulthood, between acceptance and questioning, between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable knowledge. My professional career, studying abnormal psychology, frequently intersects with cases involving shared delusions and collective misinterpretation of events. Knight's Landing experiences provide valuable context for these investigations, though I maintain strict separation between personal history and clinical analysis. Objectivity requires distance from personal experience, yet personal experience informs understanding beyond academic knowledge alone. Russell returned from military service in 2015, permanently changed by combat experiences that provided perspective on childhood fears. "Whatever happened at Knight's Landing," he once commented during rare discussion of the property, "seems less significant after witnessing human capacity for creating real horrors." Josephine pursued environmental science, specializing in soil composition analysis, career choice undoubtedly influenced by circular formations discovered that final day. Her professional research occasionally references anomalous soil degradation patterns in northern California recreational properties without specific location. Details. Wesley alone maintained connection to Uncle Kenneth's monitoring network, though he shares minimal information regarding current activities. Occasional cryptic messages suggest continued observation occurs, adapted to contemporary limitations, but preserving essential protocols established decades earlier. The circles in the field have reportedly expanded to encompass approximately 1 acre total surface area, according to Wesley's most recent update. Cache Creek has permanently altered course, now flowing in roughly circular pattern around the field rather than straight line previously observed. Satellite imagery confirms these changes, though official geographical surveys attribute alterations to natural erosion processes. Sometimes consider returning to Knight's Landing, observing changes personally rather than relying on second-hand reports and distant imagery. This consideration never progresses beyond theoretical possibility. Some boundaries, once established, should remain respected regardless of academic curiosity or personal resolution needs. What truly occurred at Knight's Landing? Multiple interpretations exist, each plausible within particular frameworks of understanding. Psychological analysis suggests shared delusion propagated through family dynamics, reinforced by isolation and environmental factors. Architectural examination indicates structural abnormalities, creating auditory phenomena misinterpreted by suggestible observers. Historical investigation reveals property location coinciding with traditional territorial boundaries between indigenous groups, potentially explaining prohibition traditions maintained without understanding original purpose. Yet these rational explanations fail to adequately address certain aspects of shared experience: the mathematical precision of scratching sequences, the physical ceiling indentations following roof incidents, the perfect circularity of field formations that continue expanding decades later. Some experiences resist complete rational categorization regardless of analytical framework applied. Perhaps most significant lesson from Knight's Landing involves boundaries themselves, not merely physical demarcations between property sections or between acceptable and forbidden behaviors, but conceptual boundaries between knowledge categories. Western intellectual tradition emphasizes rigid separation between empirical observation and subjective experience, between rational analysis and intuitive understanding. Knight's Landing exists at intersection of these domains, challenging comfortable categorization and demanding more flexible interpretation models. I maintain detailed records of all Knight's Landing experiences and subsequent research, secured with instructions for appropriate handling following my eventual death. This documentation serves dual purpose, providing research material for future investigators should significance warrant, while establishing accountability for knowledge transmission should Uncle Kenneth's boundary maintenance theories prove valid. The property itself continues physical existence approximately 1 hour from California coast, accessible via roads that remain functional despite decreasing usage. Current satellite imagery shows vegetation reclaiming most previously developed areas, erasing visible evidence of human habitation, aside from foundation outlines and the expanding circular formation in the field. Knight's Landing persists primarily as concept rather than location, an uncertainty residing at boundaries of belief, challenging comfortable explanations, and reminding those who experienced it that some knowledge remains perpetually incomplete. The scratching sounds occasionally resurface in dreams, accompanied by roof impacts that wake me to silent, empty rooms. These experiences constitute neither delusion nor supernatural visitation, but memory's persistence across time. Empirically invalid, yet experientially authentic. I remain afraid of that place, even at distance, even after years of professional training in psychological analysis. This fear represents neither weakness nor superstition, but appropriate response to demonstrated threat, regardless of its ultimately explainable or inexplicable nature. Some boundaries exist for protection rather than limitation. Some questions serve better as ongoing inquiries than resolved certainties. Knight's Landing taught this fundamental lesson. The most dangerous boundaries are those we cross without recognizing their purpose, motivated by curiosity, untempered by caution. I've constructed my professional and personal life around this understanding, approaching knowledge boundaries with appropriate respect, while maintaining willingness to consider multiple interpretive frameworks simultaneously. Perhaps this represents Knight's Landing's ultimate legacy, not definitive answers about what occurred there, but perpetual reminder that some questions must remain perpetually open, some boundaries perpetually maintained, some knowledge perpetually incomplete for reasons extending beyond academic limitation into moral necessity. Knight's Landing remains there still, whether I return or not. The circles continue expanding. The creek continues altering course. The boundaries continue requiring maintenance through collective observation and acknowledgement. This responsibility transfers across generations, maintaining vigilance against threats whose nature remains incompletely understood, yet undeniably real within lived experience. I remain afraid of that place. I should remain afraid of that place. Perhaps all of us should. I've lived my entire life in the northeastern mountains of Pennsylvania, surrounded by endless forest and rugged trails that feel more like home than any concrete sidewalk ever could. Growing up with the seasons etched into my bones, frigid winters that test your resolve and summers fragrant with pine and wildflowers, shaped how I see the world. My grandfather settled here in 1962, building the family cottage with his own hands, and we've kept the property in the family since. Vanessa, my ex-wife, was a city soul through and through. She grew up amid Trenton's busy streets and crowded sidewalks, her world filled with convenience stores and streetlights rather than deer paths and starlight. When we married in 2018, I promised to show her the quieter side of life I'd always cherished. So naturally, when planning a weekend getaway in April 2020, My family suggested a camping trip in our own backyard would be the perfect introduction to rural living. The idea seemed innocent enough, a gentle way to introduce her to outdoor life without venturing too far from comfort. My parents still lived in the family cottage, maintaining the 5 acres of woodland and meadow that had seen 4 generations of our family grow. Vanessa agreed with surprising enthusiasm, perhaps seeing it as an anthropological experiment into my upbringing. "I've never actually been camping," she admitted, as we packed the car in our Philadelphia apartment. "Not real camping. We stayed in cabins at summer camp, but that hardly counts." "Trust me," I assured her, loading our sleeping bags into the trunk. "You'll love it. It's peaceful in a way the city never is." I didn't know then how wrong I would be. Not about the peace. That part was true. The mountains offer a stillness you can't find in city limits. But peace isn't the only thing that thrives in silence and solitude. Sometimes, in that perfect quiet, other things emerge. My parents' cottage is nestled against a broad stretch of densely wooded land, with Mill Creek gurgling about 100 yards behind a stand of ancient hemlocks. We decided to camp just a short distance from the cottage, perhaps 25 yards at most, in a small clearing surrounded by sugar maples and white birch trees. It wasn't exactly untamed wilderness, but it had all the rural charm a city dweller could appreciate. The pop-up camper we used belonged to my father, a weathered Coleman he'd bought second-hand in the early 2000s. It had seen better days, but remained sturdy enough, with canvas sides that expanded to create a surprising amount of interior space. We set it up that Friday afternoon, Richard, my father, and I working the cranks, while Vanessa watched with fascination. "Honestly, I expected a tent," she said, eyeing the modest structure. "This is practically a portable hotel room." Richard laughed, his weathered face crinkling with amusement. "Well, I figured we'd ease you into it. You can try proper tent camping when you're ready for the advanced course." Vanessa surveyed our campsite with obvious interest. The clearing offered a partial view of the cottage, close enough that we could see the kitchen windows glowing with warmth as evening approached, yet far enough to feel like we were having our own adventure. Barbara, my mother, had helped us arrange a small fire pit ringed with flat stones, and we'd set up 2 folding chairs nearby. "It's beautiful here," Vanessa admitted, taking a deep breath of mountain air. "So quiet." Our 2 lab mixes, Bruno and Scout, were already exploring the perimeter, noses to the ground, tails wagging frantically as they discovered new scents. Bruno, the larger black lab mix, bounded through patches of undergrowth with reckless enthusiasm. Scout, his slightly smaller chocolate brother, followed more cautiously, but with equal curiosity. I felt a surge of pride watching Vanessa take in my childhood playground. This was home. These trees, these sounds, this particular quality of light filtering through the canopy. I wanted her to feel it too, that sense of belonging that I'd always taken for granted. "Wait until tonight," I told her, putting my arm around her shoulders. "The stars here are incredible." I spent most of that first day giving Vanessa the grand tour, the creek where I learned to fish, the grassy clearing where deer gathered at dusk, and the massive oak my grandfather had planted as a sapling decades ago. She listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about the local wildlife and vegetation. Though I could tell it was all foreign to her, she seemed genuinely interested. Bruno and Scout were having the time of their lives, racing through the underbrush and splashing in the shallow edges of the creek. Bruno, fearless as always, charged ahead into every situation, while Scout typically hung back a moment, assessing before following his brother's lead. Together they formed an unstoppable duo, exploring until their tongues lolled from exhaustion. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon. The air felt heavy with impending rain, that distinct pressure change you can almost taste. Richard approached as Vanessa and I were collecting kindling for the evening fire. "Weather Service says we're in for a serious system tonight," he said, examining the darkening sky with practiced eyes. His tone carried that note of concern I recognized from childhood, the one that preceded every important warning. How serious? I asked, straightening up with an armful of twigs. Heavy rain, strong winds, possible hail. Typical mountain storm, but it might get rough. You two might want to consider sleeping in the house tonight, instead of the camper. I brushed off his concern with a casual wave. We'll be fine, Dad. The camper's weathered worse. Besides, what's camping without a little adventure? Richard shrugged, his expression unconvinced. Suit yourself. Just know the offer stands if you change your mind. He glanced at Vanessa. First camping trip and you get a mountain thunderstorm. Talk about baptism by fire, Vanessa smiled politely. I'm excited for the experience. We'll be fine. As Richard walked back toward the cottage, I caught the subtle headshake that conveyed his disapproval. At 42, I was still occasionally subjected to his paternal judgment, particularly when it came to outdoor decisions. But I'd spent countless nights in that camper through all kinds of weather. A spring storm seemed hardly worth worrying about. Barbara called us in for an early dinner, her famous venison stew with fresh-baked sourdough, before we settled in for the night. As we ate at their well-worn oak table, the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley. Sounds like it's moving in faster than predicted, Richard commented, glancing out the window. We'd better head back and secure everything, I said, standing up. Thank you for dinner, Mom. Barbara looked concerned but didn't argue. Take the emergency lantern just in case the camp lights go out. Once darkness fell completely, the yard transformed. Wind rustled through the trees, sending shadows dancing across the ground in erratic patterns. Every few seconds, the motion sensor lights would activate, catching some stray movement, perhaps a raccoon or squirrel, before plunging the yard back into darkness. Vanessa seemed both fascinated and uneasy as we settled into our camping chairs beside the small fire. The flames struggled against occasional gusts, casting flickering light across her face. It's so different out here, she whispered, as though afraid to disturb the forest. In the city, it's never really dark or quiet. That's what I love about it, I replied, poking at the fire with a stick. You can hear yourself think. From the edge of the woods came the distinctive call of a barred owl. Who cooks for you all, followed by the distant howl of coyotes. Bruno and Scout perked up at the sound, edging closer to our chairs. Are they dangerous? The coyotes? Vanessa asked. Not really. They're usually more afraid of us than we are of them. They won't come near the fire. By the time we crawled into the camper around 11, the air had grown noticeably heavier. The dogs settled quickly on their blankets at our feet, worn out from their day of exploration. I checked that the camper was securely latched, then slipped into my sleeping bag next to Vanessa. Not exactly 5-star accommodations, I joked, shifting against the thin mattress. It's perfect, she replied, her voice already heavy with sleep. Just don't expect me to use that wilderness bathroom in the middle of the night. I chuckled, feeling myself drifting towards sleep as the first few raindrops began tapping against the canvas roof. The gentle rhythm seemed soothing at first, a natural lullaby that quickly pulled me under. I must have fallen into a deep sleep because the next thing I registered was a thunderclap so powerful it felt like the sky had split open above us. My eyes shot open to complete darkness, my heart immediately pounding. Beside me, Vanessa sat upright, muttering something inaudible over the roar outside. Rain hammered down with ferocious intensity, and wind buffeted the camper's canvas sides. Bruno and Scout transitioned instantly from peaceful sleep to high alert, ears perked forward, bodies tense. That's some storm, Vanessa said, her voice tight with poorly concealed nervousness. It'll pass, I assured her, though I was surprised by its ferocity. These mountains brew up some intense weather, but it never lasts long. A flash of lightning illuminated the interior for a split second, revealing Vanessa's wide eyes and the dog's rigid postures. In that brief moment of visibility, I noticed something odd. Bruno wasn't looking at the canvas walls or ceiling where the rain pounded. His gaze was fixed on the door. In the darkness that followed the lightning flash, I heard something that didn't belong to the storm. a sound like rapid footsteps crossing the flagstone path between the cottage and our camper. Not the casual walk of my father coming to check on us, but a frantic sprint. "Richard?" Vanessa called toward the door, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Is that you?" No answer came. Instead, something struck the camper door with tremendous force, not a knock, but a powerful impact that made the entire structure shudder. The camper rocked on its frame, and I felt my stomach lurch with the movement. Bruno, who would typically bark ferociously at any intruder, instead backed away from the door, his ears flattened against his head. A low, rumbling growl built in his chest. Scout pressed against him, mirroring his posture, trembling visibly. Another violent jolt hit the camper, this time from above. The canvas roof groaned under sudden weight, sagging inward slightly. Something heavy had landed on top of us, shifting its mass as the storm continued to rage. "What is that?" Vanessa hissed, gripping my arm with such intensity that her nails dug into my skin. I realized I'd been holding my breath. "I don't know," I whispered back, straining to make sense of what was happening. No branch could create that kind of concentrated pressure, moving deliberately across the roof. Another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the interior through the canvas, revealing Bruno's terrified stance, teeth bared but tail tucked. Scout had pressed himself into the corner of the camper, shaking uncontrollably. The weight above us shifted again, creating a slow, dragging sound across the fabric. Rain continued to hammer down, punctuated by thunderclaps that seemed to shake the very ground. For a split second, the security lights around the yard blinked on, triggered by movement, but they immediately went dark again, as though something had deliberately disabled them. "We need to get out of here," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though the thought of stepping outside filled me with dread. "We'll make a run for the cottage. It's not far." Another violent impact shook the camper, this time against the side wall nearest my head. The entire structure swayed perilously, and for a moment I feared we would tip over completely. Bruno let out a strangled bark, not his usual confident alarm, but a sound that conveyed pure fear. I fumbled in the darkness for something, anything that could serve as a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy flashlight we'd placed by the bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "When I say go," I murmured to Vanessa, "we throw open the door and run straight for the cottage. Don't look back, don't stop for anything." She nodded, her breathing quick and shallow. "The dogs will go first," I added. "They'll warn us if something's right outside." I wasn't proud of using our pets as early warning systems, but fear had overwhelmed my better judgment. I reached for the zipper on the canvas door, counting down under my breath. 3, 2, 1, go! I yanked the zipper down and flung the door open. Rain immediately blasted inside, soaking us instantly. Bruno and Scout bolted out, barking frantically now that they had an escape route. I pushed Vanessa ahead of me, then scrambled out into the deluge. The yard had transformed into a shallow lake, water pooling everywhere on the saturated ground. My shoes sank into mud as I leapt from the camper, the flashlight clutched in my white-knuckled grip. Rain lashed my face with stinging intensity, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene in stark white. Bruno and Scout charging toward the cottage, Vanessa following close behind, her nightclothes plastered to her body. And there, on the cottage's back porch, stood my parents. Richard was in boxers and a t-shirt, clearly having rushed from bed. Barbara clutched his arm, wearing a bathrobe, both of them staring wide-eyed into the storm. I forced myself to turn back toward the camper, needing to understand what had attacked us. The lightning faded, plunging everything back into darkness. But not before I glimpsed something that made my blood freeze. The canvas roof of the camper was visibly depressed in a way that couldn't be explained by rain accumulation. Something substantial was up there. As I hesitated, another lightning flash revealed the camper again, but now the roof appeared normal. Whatever had been there was gone. I sprinted toward the cottage, no longer concerned with what might be behind me, only focused on reaching safety. My feet slipped in mud, nearly sending me sprawling, but adrenaline kept me upright. I took the porch steps 2 at a time, nearly colliding with my father. "Get inside!" Richard shouted over the storm, pulling me through the doorway. Barbara slammed the door behind us, turning both locks with shaking hands. Inside, the cottage lights flickered ominously. Vanessa stood in the middle of the living room, dripping water onto the hardwood floor, her face ashen. Bruno and Scout paced restlessly, whining and periodically stopping to stare at the windows. What in God's name happened out there? Richard demanded, his expression wavering between concern and disbelief. I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound delusional. Something was on the camper, pounding on it, moving across the roof. "A branch," Barbara suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. I shook my head vehemently. "No branch." This was heavy, deliberate. The dogs were terrified. Richard moved to the window, peering out into the storm-lashed yard. "I don't see anything now." "It was there," Vanessa insisted, her voice steadier than I expected. "Something was trying to get in." We spent the rest of that night in tense vigilance. Every gust of wind that rattled the windows made us flinch. The dogs refused to settle, alternating between nervous pacing and growling at sounds only they could detect. Barbara made coffee, though none of us needed help staying awake. Toward dawn, the storm finally began to subside. Rain softened to a gentle patter, and the gaps between thunderclaps lengthened until they faded entirely. Exhaustion had settled over us like a heavy blanket, but none of us suggested sleeping. First light brought a grey, subdued morning. The yard resembled a war zone. Branches scattered everywhere, small puddles forming in every depression, the grass flattened by the force of the rain. The camper stood where we'd left it, looking surprisingly intact given the night's events. Richard, who had remained skeptical despite his obvious concern, suggested we check for damage. "Storm like that could have torn the canvas. We should at least secure it." I nodded, though the thought of approaching the camper again sent ice through my veins. Vanessa opted to stay inside with Barbara, her earlier bravery giving way to rational fear. Richard and I pulled on rubber boots and ventured outside. The air felt unusually still after the night's chaos, with only the occasional drip from overhanging branches breaking the silence. Bruno and Scout refused to follow us, watching anxiously from the porch instead. We approached the camper cautiously. From the outside it looked remarkably normal, wet and somewhat battered, but structurally sound. Richard circled it slowly, examining the canvas walls and support poles. "No obvious tears," he noted, trying to sound casual. "Let's check inside." The camper's interior was a mess. Rain had blown in through the open door, soaking our sleeping bags and personal items. I checked the roof supports, looking for any sign of the pressure we'd felt, but everything seemed intact. "Dad," I called, stepping back outside. "Come look at this." Richard joined me at the rear of the camper, where I pointed to something disturbing. 4 long impressions scored the algae and grime that had accumulated on the canvas roof, parallel marks spaced like enormous fingers, each at least 6 or 7 inches in length. Richard stared at them silently. I could see him struggling to find a rational explanation. A branch, debris blown by the wind, anything but what the marks actually resembled, a massive hand that had gripped the edge of the camper. "That's," he began, then stopped. "I've never seen anything make marks like that." I reached up to touch one of the impressions. The canvas was intact beneath it, but the pattern was unmistakable. "What animal has fingers like this, Dad?" Richard shook his head slowly. "None that I know of." We stood there for a long moment, the implications hanging between us. If not an animal, then what? Neither of us wanted to articulate the obvious question. "Let's pack up," Richard finally said, his voice unnaturally flat. "Get everything back to the house." By noon, we had dismantled the camper and stored it in the garage. Vanessa had already packed our overnight bags, making it clear she had no intention of staying another night. regardless of where we might sleep. I couldn't blame her. My own enthusiasm for the family property had been severely dampened. Over a late breakfast that no one really ate, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Barbara suggested perhaps a bear had been curious about the camper, though she couldn't explain the deliberate pattern of movement or the finger-like impressions. "Bears have pulled stunts like that before," Richard said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Remember the Johnsons' place up the road? Had a bear tear right through their screen porch a few summers back." I nodded, wanting to believe him, but the memory of that weight shifting across the roof, methodical, searching, wouldn't align with his explanation. Vanessa remained largely silent, but I could tell from her expression that she was processing everything, forming her own conclusions. When she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that silenced the room. "Whatever it was," she said quietly, "it knew we were in there. It wasn't random destruction, it was hunting." The word hung in the air between us. Hunting, it fit too perfectly with what we'd experienced. The strategic movement, the testing of entry points, the focused intensity of the attacks. We left shortly after noon, both dogs crammed into the back seat of our car, Vanessa staring straight ahead as we pulled down the long driveway. My parents stood on the front porch, waving goodbye with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Will you come back?" Vanessa asked as we turned onto the main road, leaving the mountains behind us. I hesitated, surprising myself. Those woods had been my sanctuary for 4 decades, the place I felt most at home. Yet now uncertainty clouded that connection. "Yes," I finally answered, "but not for camping. Not for a while." In the weeks and months that followed, I researched obsessively local wildlife, regional folklore, unexplained incidents in the area. I found nothing that matched our experience. My father maintained his stance that it must have been weather-related damage, though he never looked me in the eye when saying so. Vanessa and I separated 6 months later, though not because of that night. Our differences ran deeper than one frightening experience. Still, I sometimes wonder if things might have been different had her introduction to my world not been so traumatic. I've returned to my parents' property many times since then. The cottage remains a place of comfort and family connection. Yet I never venture far into the woods alone anymore, and I always return indoors well before darkness falls. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some presences are better left undisturbed. The northeastern mountains of Pennsylvania hold secrets I'm no longer eager to discover. Whatever visited us that stormy April night has never returned, or if it has, it's kept its distance. But sometimes, when rain hammers against my bedroom window and thunder shakes the walls, I find myself listening for that distinctive sound, the deliberate movement of something heavy across the roof, searching for a way in. August 14th, 2019. I was spending the night at my cousin Charlie's farmhouse, along with 9 other cousins. I should clarify that we weren't biological relatives. Our parents had been friends since college, and we'd grown up together so closely that we considered ourselves family in every way that mattered. This summer reunion had become a tradition, one I looked forward to every year. The drive to Charlie's place was familiar but always impressive. Their property stretched across 12 acres of rolling countryside in western Pennsylvania. The 2-story farmhouse stood proudly at the end of a long gravel driveway, flanked by towering oak trees. Behind the house, there were several outbuildings, including a barn that had been converted into a workshop and a chicken coop that supplied fresh eggs each morning. As I pulled up to the house, I could see the younger kids already running around the yard, their excited voices carrying across the open space. Charlie was 16, just a year younger than me, and we'd always been particularly close. She came bounding down the porch steps when she spotted my car. "You're finally here," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. "I thought you'd never make it." I laughed, returning her embrace. Traffic was awful. I swear half the state was on the highway today. Charlie helped me grab my bags from the trunk. Everyone else is already here. Mom made her famous lasagna for dinner, and there's apple pie for dessert. The smell of home-cooked food hit me as soon as we entered the house. Charlie's mother, Mrs. Walsh, was legendary for her cooking. The kitchen was buzzing with activity, adults chatting over glasses of wine while the younger kids darted between them. Fueled by excitement and sugar, Mr. Walsh, Charlie's father, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a booming laugh. He gave me a hearty pat on the back when he saw me. "There she is! We were wondering if you'd gotten lost." I settled into the comfortable chaos of the gathering, catching up with everyone. In total, there were 11 of us, cousins, 6 boys and 5 girls. The age spread was significant, with the youngest being 7, and me being one of the oldest at 17. Despite the age differences, we all got along remarkably well, slipping easily into the familiar patterns of our friendship. As the evening progressed, we moved to the sprawling living room, with its stone fireplace and worn, comfortable furniture. The adults reminisced about their college days, while we kids planned our activities for the weekend. There would be swimming in the creek that ran through the property, games of capture the flag across the fields, and nights spent telling stories under the stars. What I didn't know then was that this particular visit would be nothing like the others. By the end of the weekend, none of us would see this place the same way again. After dinner, we discussed sleeping arrangements. As usual, the boys would take the sunroom near the front of the house, while us girls would occupy the toy room at the back. The boys got the sunroom because it was larger, and they outnumbered us. I didn't mind. The toy room had its own charm, with bookshelves full of board games, a small television, and a door leading directly to the backyard. Charlie showed me to the toy room, where I'd be sleeping alongside her, Stacy, Jasmine, and Zoe. We set up our sleeping bags in a circle, claiming our territory for the night. "Remember last year when we stayed up until sunrise telling ghost stories?" Stacy asked, arranging her pillow. Jasmine groaned. "Please, no ghost stories this year. I couldn't sleep for days after that." "Don't worry," I assured her. "We'll stick to happier topics." The Walsh farmhouse had been in Charlie's family for 3 generations. It had the comfortable, lived-in feel of a place that had witnessed countless family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet, everyday moments. The floors creaked in certain spots, the doors sometimes stuck, and there were drafts that couldn't be explained. But these imperfections only added to its character. From the toy room window, I could see the expanse of the backyard, a well-maintained lawn that stretched about 300 meters before meeting a dense line of trees. Beyond that forest was another property, barely visible through the foliage. "Who lives over there?" I asked, pointing to a faint light visible through the trees. Charlie's expression darkened slightly. "Mr. Hadley. He moved in about 3 years ago." Something in her tone made me curious. "You don't like him?" She shrugged, but I could tell there was more to it. "He's just odd. Dad says he keeps to himself mostly, but sometimes he shows up at the edge of our property. He's probably just being neighborly, but there's something about him that doesn't sit right." I didn't think much of it at the time. Every neighborhood had its eccentric characters, and rural areas were no exception. Instead, I focused on helping set up the room for our stay, arranging the sleeping bags and pillows, while the younger girls debated which movies to watch. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The swing set and trampoline stood silently, waiting for tomorrow's activities. I noticed a slight movement at the edge of the forest, probably just a deer or some other woodland creature, I thought. I didn't realize then that we were being watched. The next morning broke with clear skies and the promise of a perfect summer day. After a breakfast of pancakes and fresh berries, we all headed outside to enjoy the weather. The adults had gone into town for supplies, leaving us under the supervision of Charlie's older brother, who was home from college for the summer. He was supposedly in charge, but in reality, he was more interested in texting his girlfriend than keeping an eye on us. The backyard was a paradise for kids. There was a large wooden swing set that Mr. Walsh had built himself, a sandbox for the younger ones, and the prized possession, a 14-foot trampoline that could accommodate multiple jumpers at once. Beyond the manicured lawn, the woods beckoned with the promise of adventure. We spent the morning playing a massive game of tag that spanned the entire yard. By noon, we were hot and sweaty, sprawled across the grass, catching our breath. That's when Charlie suggested we explore the woods. Not too deep, she cautioned. Just along the edge. There's a cool fallen tree that makes a perfect bridge over the creek. Gabes, Felix, and I followed her lead, with Stacy trailing behind, somewhat reluctantly. The younger kids stayed behind, more interested in the trampoline than woodland exploration. The temperature dropped noticeably as we stepped under the canopy of trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you speak in hushed tones without realizing it. We had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Charlie suddenly froze, holding up her hand for us to stop. "What is it?" I whispered. She pointed ahead. Through the trees about 50 yards away, I could make out the figure of a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing in our direction. From that distance, I couldn't make out his features clearly, but I could tell he was middle-aged, wearing dark clothes despite the summer heat. "Is that Mr. Hadley?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Charlie nodded. "Let's go back." We turned and began walking quickly in the opposite direction. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. There was nothing inherently threatening about a man standing on his own property. Yet something about the way he had been watching us, so still, so focused, had raised goosebumps on my arms. Back at the house, Charlie explained to me that Mr. Hadley had moved to the area 3 years ago. Nobody knew much about him, where he came from, what he did for work, or why he had chosen this remote location. He lived alone in a small house that was barely visible through the trees. "He never comes to community events," Charlie said. Dad invited him to the annual summer barbecue when he first moved in, but he declined, said he preferred his privacy. "That's not so strange," I offered. "Some people just like to be alone." Charlie lowered her voice. "It's not just that. He's always watching us, especially when we're playing outside. Mom says he's harmless, but—" She trailed off. "But what? I've seen him standing at the edge of our property, just staring at the house, sometimes for hours. And he's always there when we're using the trampoline or the swing set. It's like he's waiting for something." I thought about the still figure we'd seen in the woods. "Have you told your parents about this?" "Yeah, Dad went over to talk to him once, asked him to stop hanging around our property line. Mr. Hadley apologized, said he was just taking walks and didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable. But he still does it." I wanted to dismiss Charlie's concerns as the product of an overactive imagination, but I couldn't ignore the disquiet I'd felt in the woods. There was something unsettling about being watched, especially by someone who seemed to have no reason to be there. That afternoon, we decided to take advantage of the summer heat by having a water balloon fight. Mr. Walsh had filled dozens of balloons for us, and we split into teams, boys versus girls. The yard became a battlefield of squealing children and bursting water balloons. I was crouched behind the swing set, a cache of balloons at my feet, when I spotted movement at the edge of the woods. I squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out the figure partially hidden by the trees. It was him again, Mr. Hadley. He was standing just inside the tree line, watching our game with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I nudged Charlie, who was hiding beside me. "Look," I whispered, gesturing subtly toward the woods. Her face paled. "He's back. We abandoned our water balloons, the game forgotten." Charlie called the others, and we all retreated to the porch, keeping our eyes on the figure in the woods. He remained motionless, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. "Should we tell your mom?" I asked. Charlie nodded. "Yeah, I think we should." Mrs. Walsh was in the kitchen preparing dinner when we told her about the man watching us from the woods. Her expression tightened, a mixture of concern and frustration crossing her face. "Stay inside for now," she said firmly. "I'll talk to your father when he gets back from town." We spent the next hour huddled in the sunroom, taking turns peeking through the curtains. Mr. Hadley had disappeared from his spot in the woods, but none of us felt brave enough to venture back outside. Mr. Walsh returned home around 5 p.m. After a hushed conversation with his wife, he grabbed his phone and walked out to the edge of the property. We watched from the window as he stood there, phone to his ear, occasionally gesturing toward the woods. When he returned, his face was grim. "I spoke with Mr. Hadley," he announced to the room, reminded him about our property boundaries, and asked him to stay on his side of the woods. He apologized and said he was just taking a walk. "Did he say why he was watching us?" Charlie asked. Mr. Walsh hesitated. "He said he wasn't watching anyone, just enjoying the forest. But I've made it clear that if I see him near our property again, especially when you kids are outside, I'll have to take more serious measures." The tension in the room eased somewhat, but an undercurrent of unease remained. Dinner was a subdued affair, with the adults making forced conversation while we kids exchanged worried glances. After we finished eating, Mr. Walsh announced that we'd be having a bonfire that evening, a tradition during our summer gatherings. "But we'll keep it in the front yard," he added, "away from the woods." As darkness fell, we gathered around the fire pit in the circular driveway. The flames cast flickering shadows across our faces as we roasted marshmallows and told stories. Despite the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being surrounded by family, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the darkness beyond the circle of light. After the bonfire, we retired to our respective sleeping areas. The boys headed to the sunroom, while we girls made our way to the toy room. Despite the early attention, we were all in high spirits from the evening's activities. Stacy suggested we watch a movie, and after some debate, we settled on a romantic comedy. Not my first choice, but I was outvoted. As the others became engrossed in the film, I found myself drawn to the window. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, the swing set and trampoline casting long shadows across the grass. The edge of the forest was a dark line against the night sky, impenetrable and mysterious. I was about to turn away when I noticed a flash of light among the trees, brief but unmistakable. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined it. Then it came again, a pinprick of brightness that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Charlie," I whispered, not wanting to alarm the others. "Come look at this." She joined me at the window, her face pale in the moonlight. "What is it?" I saw a light in the woods. "There. Did you see it?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "Could be a flashlight. Maybe Dad is checking the property." But we both knew Mr. Walsh was inside. We could hear his distinctive laugh from the living room where the adults were playing cards. We watched for several more minutes, seeing occasional flashes of light moving through the trees. They seemed to be getting closer to the house, though it was hard to gauge distance in the darkness. "Should we tell someone?" I asked. Charlie bit her lip. "Let's watch a bit longer. It could be nothing." By the time the movie ended, the younger girls were asleep, curled up in their sleeping bags. Charlie and I remained by the window, speaking in hushed tones as we continued our vigil. The mysterious lights had stopped, but the unease remained. "Remember last summer," Charlie said suddenly, "when we heard those weird noises in the woods?" I nodded. We had been playing hide-and-seek at dusk when strange sounds had emanated from the forest, not animal noises, but not quite human either. Mr. Walsh had dismissed it as coyotes, but none of us had been entirely convinced. "And the summer before that," Charlie continued, "when Gabe's found those weird markings on the trees along the property line?" The markings had been a series of symbols carved into the bark of several trees. They didn't resemble any alphabet I recognized, and Mr. Walsh had attributed them to bored teenagers from town. But now With the knowledge of Mr. Hadley's watchful presence, I wondered if there might be a connection. "How long has Mr. Hadley been watching your family?" I asked. Charlie shrugged. "It started subtly. At first we'd just occasionally see him at the edge of the property. Then it became more frequent. Last summer he started trying to talk to us, especially to the girls." "What would he say?" "Nothing threatening exactly. He'd ask if our parents were home or invite us to come see his house. Said he had cookies or lemonade. Mom told us never to go near his property and to always come inside if we spotted him." I remembered the figure in the woods earlier that day, so still and focused. "Has he ever come onto your property?" Charlie nodded, her expression grim. "A few times. Once, he approached Mom while she was hanging laundry. Dad came out and warned him to leave. Another time, he was found near the trampoline early in the morning, before anyone was up. Dad called the police that time, but they said they couldn't do much without proof he was trespassing with intent to harm." A chill ran down my back, despite the warmth of the summer night. "Do you think he's dangerous?" "I don't know," Charlie admitted, "but something doesn't feel right about him." We fell silent, our eyes drawn back to the darkness beyond the window. The yard was still, the moonlight casting everything in silver and shadow. But somewhere out there, I knew Mr. Hadley was watching. Waiting for what I couldn't say. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start, disoriented and confused. The room was dark, the television silent. Charlie was asleep beside me, her breathing deep and regular. The others were, scattered around the room in their sleeping bags, undisturbed. What had woken me? I lay still, listening intently. The house was quiet, except for the usual nighttime sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of settling wood. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from outside. Moving carefully to avoid waking the others, I made my way to the window. The moon had moved across the sky, casting different shadows now. The backyard was silver blue in the moonlight, eerily beautiful and still. Except for the trampoline. Something or someone was moving on the trampoline. The surface was depressing slightly, as if under the weight of a person, but I couldn't see anyone there. The rustling sound continued, rhythmic and persistent. My heart began to race. I watched, transfixed, as the trampoline's surface continued to move. Then, at the edge of the woods, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows, tall and lean, moving with deliberate stealth toward the house. I ducked down below the windowsill, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. After a moment, I gathered my courage and peered over the edge of the sill. The figure was closer now, moving across the yard with purposeful strides. As it passed through a patch of moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a face, gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a thin mouth set in a hard line. Mr. Hadley. He was carrying something in his hand, a long, thin object that glinted in the moonlight. With trembling fingers, I reached out and shook Charlie awake. "Charlie," I whispered urgently, "wake up, he's here." She blinked groggily. "What? Who's here?" "Mr. Hadley. He's in your backyard, coming toward the house." She was instantly alert, scrambling to the window. We watched as Mr. Hadley approached the back door, the very door that led into our room. He paused there, his head tilted as if listening. Then slowly he reached out and tested the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. We ducked down again, pressing ourselves against the wall beneath the window. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it through the door. Beside me, Charlie was trembling, her face pale in the darkness. "What do we do?" I whispered. "Wake the others," she replied. "Quietly. We need to get to my parents' room." We moved silently through the room, gently shaking the other girls awake. They blinked in confusion, but quickly understood the urgency of the situation when we explained in hushed tones. Together, we crept toward the door that led to the hallway. Just as we reached it, we heard a scratching sound at the back door, the sound of metal against metal. He was trying to pick the lock. "Go!" Charlie urged, pushing the younger girls ahead of her. "Get to my parents' room now." We moved as quickly as we dared, trying to minimize the creaking of the floorboards. Behind us, the scratching continued, more insistent now. We had just reached the hallway when we heard a different sound, the sharp crack of breaking wood. He was forcing the door. "Dad!" Charlie screamed, abandoning all pretense of quiet. "Dad, help!" The house erupted into chaos. Lights flicked on, doors slammed open, and footsteps thundered down the hallway. Mr. Walsh appeared, his hair disheveled from sleep, his eyes wild with concern. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Mr. Hadley," Charlie gasped. "He's breaking in through the back door." Mr. Walsh's face darkened with fury. "Get to our bedroom," he ordered. "All of you now." He turned to his wife, who had appeared behind him. "Call 911. Tell them we have an intruder." We scrambled toward the master bedroom, the boys joining us in the hallway, awakened by the commotion. Mrs. Walsh herded us into the room, her hands shaking as she dialed the police. From the safety of the master bedroom, we heard Mr. Walsh's voice, deep and commanding. "Stop right there, Hadley. The police are on their way." There was silence, then the sound of breaking glass. Someone cried out. I couldn't tell if it was Mr. Walsh or Mr. Hadley. Mrs. Walsh pushed us toward the closet. "Inside," she instructed. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." We crowded into the walk-in closet, pulling the door shut behind us. I found myself pressed against Charlie, our hands clasped tightly together. The younger children were crying, their sobs muffled by the clothing surrounding us. Through the door, we could hear the sounds of a struggle, heavy footsteps, objects being knocked over, the occasional grunt of effort. Then suddenly, a loud thud, followed by silence. We waited, our breath held, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what had happened. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard Mrs. Walsh's voice, trembling but clear. "The police are here. It's safe to come out now." We emerged from the closet to find the house swarming with police officers. Mr. Walsh was sitting on the edge of the bed, a paramedic attending to a cut on his forehead. Mrs. Walsh was speaking with a police officer, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "What happened?" Charlie asked, rushing to her father's side. "He broke through the back door," Mr. Walsh explained, wincing as the paramedic cleaned his wound. "I confronted him, but he had a knife. We struggled and I managed to knock him down. The police arrived just in time." I looked around the room, suddenly realizing that Mr. Hadley was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" "They took him away," Mrs. Walsh said, her voice hollow. "He'll be charged with breaking and entering, assault and attempted. Well, they found things in his pockets. Zip ties, duct tape, a sedative." A chill ran through me as I realized the implications of what she was saying. Mr. Hadley hadn't come just to frighten us or to steal. He had come with a plan that involved taking someone. The police asked us to remain in the living room while they processed the scene. They took our statements one by one, asking detailed questions about Mr. Hadley's behavior in the past and the events of that night. I described the lights I had seen in the woods, the figure on the trampoline, and the moment when I spotted him approaching the house. "You kids did exactly the right thing," the officer told us. "You stayed together, you alerted the adults, and you found a safe place to hide. Your quick thinking prevented what could have been a much worse situation." But his words, meant to comfort, only underscored the danger we had been in. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the yard, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't woken up when we did. If we hadn't seen Mr. Hadley approaching the house. The police search of the woods between the properties revealed a makeshift camp, a place where Mr. Hadley had apparently spent many nights watching the house. They found binoculars, notebooks filled with observations about the family's routines, and photographs taken through windows when no one was looking. Most disturbing of all, they found a small collection of items that had gone missing from the Walsh home over the past year. A hairbrush, a sock, a hair tie, small things that no one had thought to report stolen. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of police interviews. concerned phone calls from parents, and hushed conversations among the adults. Our carefree summer gathering had been irrevocably altered by the events of that night. Mr. Hadley was held without bail, charged with multiple felonies. The police investigation revealed a history of similar behavior in other communities, watching families, targeting young girls, though he had never before escalated to breaking and entering. There were whispers of worse crimes, of missing persons cases in areas where he had previously lived. But nothing could be proven. On Sunday evening, as we prepared to return to our respective homes, I found Charlie sitting alone on the front porch steps. Her usually vibrant face was subdued, her eyes distant. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting beside her. She shrugged. "I will be, I guess. It's just, this was our safe place, you know. Now it feels different." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Walsh farmhouse had always been a sanctuary, a place of joy and freedom. Now it was tainted by the memory of fear, of vulnerability. "Do you think you'll be able to sleep in the toy room again?" I asked. Charlie was quiet for a moment. "Dad's already talking about renovating it, turning it into something else. Maybe a study or a sewing room for Mom. I don't think any of us want to use it as a bedroom anymore." I put my arm around her shoulders. "It'll get better with time," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "The important thing is that everyone is safe." She nodded, but I could tell she was still troubled. "What if he gets out?" she asked quietly. "What if he comes back?" I had no answer for that. The justice system, for all its flaws, would likely keep Mr. Hadley imprisoned for a long time. But the fear he had instilled, the sense of violation, of innocence lost, would not so easily be locked away. As we sat there, watching the sun set behind the trees, I thought about the invisible boundaries we draw around ourselves, the illusions of safety we construct. Mr. Hadley had shattered those illusions, revealing the fragility of our sense of security. Mr. Walsh came out onto the porch, his face weary but determined. "Time to head home," he said gently. "Your parents are waiting." We stood, gathering our belongings. Before I left, I hugged Charlie tightly. "Call me if you need to talk," I whispered. "Any time, day or night." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I will. Thanks for being here." As I drove away from the Walsh farmhouse, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The house stood as it always had, solid and welcoming, against the backdrop of the Pennsylvania countryside. But I knew that inside things had changed. The carefree summers of our childhood had come to an abrupt end, replaced by a wariness that would never completely fade. Mr. Hadley was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for his crimes. The evidence found in his makeshift camp, combined with his prior record, was enough to convince the judge of the serious nature of his intentions. But even as the legal proceedings concluded, the psychological impact lingered.